Nature is healing in ways that will leave you speechless. The most unlikely animals are being placed in the most impossible environments. And what happens next is rewriting everything we thought we knew about our planet. From beavers transforming barren wastelands into thriving ecosystems, to billions of oysters purifying entire harbors, to wolves changing the course of rivers. These are nature's most jaw-dropping comebacks. We're starting with the videos you couldn't stop watching, and trust us, you won't want to miss a single one. These are the most incredible wildlife and ecological restoration stories ever captured on camera. Can you imagine watching a handful of beavers step onto barren, sun-baked earth where nothing grows, where water had not flowed in years, and then witnessing them completely transform an entire valley? The ground cracked like shattered glass, not a single tree in sight. Rivers that once ran full now sat empty, their beds exposed to the scorching sun. This is what the Methau and Yakima watersheds in Washington looked like in the early 2000s. Heat waves rippled across the landscape. Wildfires tore through what little vegetation remained, consuming 70% of the forests that once shaded these rivers. Ash clouds billowed into the sky. The charred earth could not absorb rain when it finally came. Instead, black mudslides rushed down hillsides, carrying debris and leaving destruction in their wake. Fish that once filled these rivers were gone. The water that did flow was recycled wastewater, thick with algae blooming under the summer sun. Birds that used to flock to wetlands had nowhere to land. The cycle kept repeating: drought, then fire, then erosion, then death. Engineers proposed solutions. Workers poured concrete for massive water storage reservoirs. Bulldozers carved out artificial ponds. Construction crews installed pipes stretching for miles. Each project cost between $500,000 and $2 million, and most of them failed. In Utah and Oregon, crews built structures designed to mimic beaver dams. Heavy rains washed them away within months. Workers had to constantly repair and maintain them. A study from 2017 by the University of Idaho showed these artificial structures simply couldn't replicate what real beavers do. But scientists remembered something. Centuries ago, before fur trappers arrived, an estimated 60 to 400 million beavers built dams across North America. You could see their work everywhere. Ponds reflecting the sky. Streams winding through wetlands, water spreading across valleys instead of rushing straight to the ocean. Then the fur trade arrived. Trappers hunted beavers relentlessly. By the early 1900s, the animals had nearly vanished. And when the beavers disappeared, their dams crumbled. The Methau and Yakima valleys lost thousands of these natural water storage systems. In 2007, wildlife biologists launched an audacious experiment. They trapped beavers that were causing problems in cities, animals that were flooding golf courses, and toppling ornamental trees. Instead of killing them, they loaded these beavers into transport trucks. The trucks drove to the highlands, to valleys where water barely flowed, where no trees grew. Workers opened the cages. Beavers emerged onto landscapes that looked nothing like beaver habitat. Skeptics watched and shook their heads. How would tree-cutting rodents survive without trees? And how would dam builders work without water? But these beavers didn't give up. Within weeks, you could see them gathering whatever they could find: dried grass, sagebrush, even small rocks. They piled these materials across dry creek beds. The structures looked pathetic at first, barely 2 feet high, more like beaver experiments than proper dams. Then spring arrived. Snowmelt rushed down from the mountains. When the water hit those small dams, something remarkable happened. Instead of racing downstream and disappearing in days, the water slowed. It pooled. It spread sideways into the parched soil. Underground, moisture began moving through channels that had been dry for decades. Scientists monitoring the sites with sensors watched readings climb. Soil moisture increased by 30 to 40% within just months. Springs that hadn't flowed in years suddenly gurgled to life. Green shoots appeared around the beaver ponds. Willows pushed up through the damp earth. Their roots dug deeper. More water stayed in the ground. The beavers now had real building materials. You could watch them cutting down saplings, dragging branches, expanding their dams. Cottonwoods and aspens followed the willows. Birds returned, landing on branches, building nests. Insects buzzed over the water. Dragonflies darted between reeds. The soil darkened with organic matter. Earthworms churned through the earth. Within 3 years, valleys that had looked like wastelands were covered in lush green corridors. Trees now shaded the streams. The water stayed cool even during summer heat. Temperatures dropped below 68 degrees Fahrenheit, the critical threshold where salmon eggs can survive. And the salmon came back. Fish pushed upstream, leaping over rocks, navigating the complex pools the beavers had created. Young salmon found hiding places among submerged branches. They had more food, more shelter, more space to grow. Scientists counted fish densities and couldn't believe the numbers. 4 to 5 times more salmon in areas with beaver dams compared to streams without them. Then wildfire season arrived. Flames swept across the region, consuming everything in their path. But when the fires reached beaver wetlands, something unexpected happened. The saturated ground, the green vegetation, the standing water, these created barriers the flames could not easily cross. Researchers tracked 5 major wildfires over 10 years. In areas where beavers had built their wetlands, only 2 to 3% of trees burned. In areas without beavers, up to 60% of the forest was destroyed. The economic impact was staggering. Fighting wildfires costs tens of millions of dollars, but relocating a beaver pair costs only $2,000 to $3,000. Farmers who had initially complained about beaver damage started noticing benefits. Their wells were not running dry anymore. Groundwater aquifers were recharging. Water that the beavers stored during spring snowmelt trickled out slowly through summer. Pastures stayed green without expensive pumping. One rancher in eastern Washington calculated he was saving over $5,000 per year. By 2021, more than 240 beavers had been released across 50 sites in the Methau watershed alone. 64% of them successfully established territories, a remarkable rate for such territorial animals. Each breeding pair was creating cascading benefits that rippled through entire ecosystems. Moose waded through beaver ponds. Elk grazed in the wetland meadows. Mink and muskrats returned to hunt along the water's edge. Migrating birds dropped down to rest and feed. Areas that had supported maybe a dozen species now hosted over 100. The model spread beyond Washington. In 2011, near Little Buffalo, Canada, an oil pipeline leaked 28,000 barrels. Emergency crews rushed to respond, but a natural beaver dam had already trapped the oil, preventing it from contaminating the river downstream. In the Chesapeake Bay region, beaver ponds were filtering nitrogen pollution so effectively, they removed 45% of the nutrients causing toxic algae blooms. To achieve the same results, wastewater treatment plants would need to spend millions of dollars. In Alberta's Wood Buffalo National Park, researchers discovered a beaver dam stretching 850 meters, over half a mile long. Satellite images showed the massive structure, longer than the famous Hoover Dam built by humans. It took an estimated 7 generations of beavers to complete. Then, in May 2025, something happened in the Czech Republic that left ecologists laughing in disbelief. Officials had spent 7 years and over $30 billion trying to restore the Bodine wetland. Paperwork piled up. Engineers drew blueprints. Nothing worked. Then they released 8 beavers. Within 2 days, the animals had built a chain of functioning dams. Within weeks, crayfish returned, rare green frogs reappeared, and migratory birds landed on the new ponds. Experts admitted the beavers had done it better than any human plan. Back in Washington, the project continues to expand. Researchers now deploy thermal sensors and soil moisture monitors across beaver sites. Drones fly overhead, mapping wetland growth. GPS collars track beaver movements and behavior patterns. A 2024 report from the Washington State Department of Ecology showed areas with returned beavers were holding 15 to 20% more water during summer months. Wildfire risk had dropped by 40%. The diversity of aquatic plants had doubled. Over the next decade, Washington plans to restore at least 500 kilometers of streams using beaver engineering. But the project has evolved beyond just releasing animals. Indigenous communities are participating, sharing knowledge passed down for generations. Farmers are learning to work with beavers instead of against them. Citizen scientists, including school children, are monitoring local beaver populations. The message is becoming clear. For decades, humans believed every environmental problem needed a technological solution. Bigger dams, more irrigation systems, better engineering. Billions of dollars poured into projects that often failed. Then a 30-kilogram rodent proved it could do the job better, faster, and cheaper. 10 million years of evolution had already perfected the solution. These animals weren't just living in ecosystems, they were creating them, maintaining them, healing them. Water that was rushing away now stays and spreads. Ground that was cracked and dying is now moist and alive. Fish that had disappeared are returning in thousands. Forests that burned are growing back. And it's all happening because people finally stepped back and let nature's engineers do what they have always done best. The transformation continues. Valleys once written off as dead are now thriving. Rivers, once empty, are flowing again. Across a forgotten stretch of northern Canada, beavers transform scorched, empty land and into the world's largest dam. An engineering feat 850 meters long, so immense it is visible from space. But just decades earlier, this keystone species teetered on the brink of extinction, their near disappearance leaving vast landscapes barren. What happened to unleash such overwhelming power from creatures nearly erased? The answer begins with a desperate gamble and one of the most bizarre wildlife interventions in history. Before beavers reshaped the Canadian wilderness, their numbers once defined entire continents. North America's rivers and wetlands teemed with beavers. Estimates range from 60 million to 400 million animals before European traders arrived. Their dams slowed rivers, raised water tables, and created sprawling wetlands that supported a mosaic of life, from fish to migratory birds. For centuries, these vast engineered landscapes stretched from the boreal forests of Canada to the valleys of California and the marshes of the Atlantic coast. That abundance vanished with astonishing speed. The European appetite for beaver pelts, soft and waterproof and prized for hats, sparked a fur trade that swept across the continent. By the early 1800s, companies like the Hudson's Bay Company sent trappers deep into the wilderness, stripping entire watersheds of beaver. In the Columbia River Basin, policies even called for deliberate extermination to block American rivals, with thousands of animals killed each year. As the trade intensified, harvests plummeted. By the late 19th century, the once vast beaver population had crashed to as few as 100,000, scattered in remote corners of Canada and the Mountain West. The ecological cost was staggering. Without beavers, streams ran unchecked, carving deeper channels and draining wetlands that had stored water for centuries. Over 195,000 square kilometers of U.S. wetlands disappeared, an area larger than England, as beaver dams collapsed and meadows dried out. Landscapes that had pulsed with life grew silent. In the absence of beaver ponds, salmon runs faded, waterfowl lost nesting grounds, and plants adapted to wet soils vanished. The beaver disappearance left a void that echoed across ecosystems. Survival became a matter of luck and geography. A few beavers clung to isolated habitats in places like Idaho and northern Canada, shielded by distance from hungry trappers. But for most of North America, the beaver became a memory, visible only in abandoned dams and ghostly drained wetlands. The loss was not just of a species, but of an entire way that water, land, and life had once been woven together. The land waited, parched and empty, for a solution that no one yet imagined. In the summer of 1948, a team from Idaho Fish and Game faced a challenge that sounded more like a prank than a conservation project. Beavers labeled as troublemakers for flooding roads and orchards around McCall and Payette Lake needed to be moved far from people. The Chamberlain Basin, deep inside the Frank Church River of no-return wilderness, was so remote that mules could not reach it, and trucks were out of the question. The solution came from leftover World War II supplies: parachutes. The plan was simple. Pack pack beavers in wooden crates, attach surplus parachutes, and drop them from planes into new territory. The first volunteer was a sturdy male beaver named Geronimo. Before risking a full relocation, Geronimo endured a series of test flights. Each time he was loaded into a custom-built box designed to open on impact, cushioned with sagebrush and excelsior. Pilots climbed to a few hundred feet. The crate tumbled out, and the parachute blossomed open. On landing, the box would pop apart, and Geronimo would waddle out, unscathed and ready for another round. He passed every test, showing little more than mild annoyance at the repeated journeys. With the system proven, crews began transporting beaver pairs to the airstrip. Each animal was loaded into its own crate, the parachutes carefully packed and checked. Pilots circled over the Chamberlain Basin, scanning for open meadows and slow streams. At the right moment, the crates were released, drifting gently to Earth. On landing, most boxes burst open as designed, releasing startled but unharmed beavers into a landscape that had not seen their kind in living memory. Of the 76 beavers dropped, only one crate failed, and that animal died on impact. The other 75 survived the journey, quickly finding water and beginning to build. The Chamberlain Basin, once described as dry and lifeless, began to change. Within a few seasons, beaver families had constructed dams, slowed streams, and spread water across the valley. The test subject, Geronimo, was released last, rejoining his species in a new wilderness. Over the next decade, the landscape transformed. Ponds spread, willows and alders flourished, and wildlife returned to the newly created wetlands. What started as a quirky experiment dropping beavers from the sky became one of the most successful and unusual wildlife relocations in North American history. The legacy of those parachuted beavers would ripple out for generations, turning dead land green once again. In the years after the parachute drop, the Chamberlain Basin underwent a transformation that would have seemed impossible to those who first called it dead land. At Baugh Creek, a place once marked by dry channels and sparse grass, the work of beavers began to show in the most literal sense, from above. Satellite images taken decades apart reveal a landscape shifting from pale brown to deep green. The lines of new ponds and meandering wetlands trace the handiwork of beaver families, each generation adding to the patchwork of water and life. Vegetation surveys tell the same story from the ground. Where only drought-tolerant shrubs once survived, sedges and willows now crowd the banks. Plant diversity in these beaver-shaped wetlands rose by nearly 1/3. Grasses, wildflowers, and young trees flourished in the moist soil, drawing insects and birds that had long abandoned the valley. The return of water brought back frogs, ducks, and trout, each species finding a niche in the mosaic of ponds and marshes. Hydrologists tracked the changes in water flow. Instead of spring floods rushing unchecked down the valley, beaver dams slowed the current, spreading water across the floodplain. The land began to act like a sponge, soaking up rainfall and releasing it slowly through the summer. Even in dry years, the wetlands remained lush, their steady seepage feeding streams that once ran dry by midsummer. From space, the impact stands out as a green ribbon winding through the landscape. NASA Landsat images, spanning decades, show the steady advance of wetland vegetation along Baugh Creek. What began as a handful of parachuted beavers grew into a living system, visible not just to local ranchers, but to satellites orbiting hundreds of kilometers above. The beaver's engineering did not just patch up a stream, it rewrote the valley's future, creating a refuge for life in a region once written off as barren. The next question is how these animals accomplish such feats, turning simple materials into structures that hold water and shape entire ecosystems. Their durable, iterative engineering starts with selecting running water, felling trees, and anchoring sticks and mud to slow flow. Over time, those simple acts spread moisture, build habitat, and transform dust into lasting wetlands. A beaver's transformation of a barren valley begins with a single sound: running water. Drawn to the noise of a trickling stream, beavers respond instinctively, searching for the right place to build. They favor gentle slopes, less than 2% grade, where water moves slowly and the risk of washout is low. In places like the Birch Mountain foothills of northern Alberta, these shallow gradients stretch for hundreds of meters, providing the perfect canvas for their work. Construction starts with felling nearby trees using chisel-shaped orange incisors that never stop growing. Beavers drag branches, sticks, and saplings to the chosen site, anchoring the first layer deep into the mud. Mud, stones, and woven twigs fill the gaps, each addition guided by the sound of water leaking through. If they hear a trickle, they patch it. This process repeats night after night, the dam growing longer as each leak is sealed. Unlike concrete walls, beaver dams are intentionally leaky, and water seeps through, slowing the flow without stopping it. This leaky dam design lets water spread out, raising the local water table and creating a broad, shallow pond. The largest dams, like the 850-meter structure in Wood Buffalo National Park, are built by multiple generations. Each family extends the work of its predecessors, weaving new branches into the old, thickening the structure and expanding its reach. The dam's length scales with the width of the valley and the abundance of available wood. In these northern wetlands, willows and poplars regrow quickly, providing a steady supply of building material within easy reach of the water's edge. Beavers dig canals branching out from the pond, floating heavy logs back to the main construction site, and reducing the need to haul loads over land. Behind the dam, the pond becomes a safe haven. Here, beavers build their lodges, domed structures of branches and mud anchored in deep water. Each lodge features underwater entrances, keeping predators at bay. Inside, a raised chamber stays dry, even when the world outside freezes. The roof is vented for fresh air, and the walls are thick enough to withstand the coldest winters. These lodges often become microhabitats, sheltering not only beaver families but also nesting birds and amphibians drawn to the warmth and safety of the beaver-made pond. By weaving water, wood, and mud into living architecture, beavers create more than shelter. Their structures anchor entire ecosystems, setting the stage for landscapes that can resist drought, fire, and the extremes of a changing climate. In July 2018, flames swept across Idaho's Sawtooth foothills, churning up a wildfire that would scorch more than 65,000 acres. The Sharps fire burned hot and fast, blackening hillsides and swallowing sagebrush as it moved. Yet when the smoke cleared, a peculiar patchwork stood out. Along Baugh Creek, where beaver families had shaped the land for decades, the wetlands remained green and wet, a stark contrast to the charred terrain all around. Fire crews used those pools as safe zones, and wildlife clustered in the cool, damp refuge. Remote cameras documented the difference. Surface temperatures in beaver ponds ran several degrees cooler than the scorched uplands, and the waterlogged meadows resisted the flames that swept through neighboring grasslands. This was not an isolated case. Across the western United States, beaver wetlands have repeatedly served as natural fire breaks. Studies measuring fire severity found that areas with active beaver colonies experienced less intense burns and recovered more quickly. Wetland plants, protected by persistent water, sprouted back within weeks. In places where beaver dams slowed streams and spread water across the valley floor, the landscape simply did not burn the same way. Scientists tracked these patterns with satellite data, confirming that beaver-shaped zones stayed greener and cooler, even as wildfires grew larger and more frequent in a warming climate. To understand the scale of these changes, NASA joined forces with restoration scientists in 2023, deploying Landsat satellites to monitor beaver reintroduction sites in Idaho. Their focus was the descendants of those parachuted beavers and the landscapes they had rebuilt. Using a tool called MRR-MADE, analysts mapped vegetation greening and water retention over time. The data told a clear story. Beaver wetlands held water 30 to 50% longer during droughts, and their soils locked away carbon at rates up to 5 times higher than nearby undammed streams. In drought-stricken years, The difference was visible from orbit, a ribbon of green threading through otherwise faded valleys. NASA's lead analyst described the findings as a turning point. The evidence was no longer anecdotal or local. Satellite imagery, time-stamped and geo-referenced, showed that beaver engineering could be measured in pixels and climate metrics. These results are now guiding policy, with agencies shifting funding toward beaver-based restoration projects. In a world facing more frequent fires and deeper droughts, the case for letting beavers build is now written into the land itself and confirmed from space. Across continents, the beaver's comeback is no longer a quiet story of survival. It is a movement reshaping landscapes and policies alike. In Canada, Wood Buffalo National Park stands as a living example of what is possible when nature is given space and time. Here, the world's longest beaver dam, spanning 850 meters, has become more than an ecological oddity. For conservationists and policymakers, it is a symbol of scale, persistence, and the power of hands-off restoration. The dam's arc, visible from space, draws scientists, land managers, and indigenous partners into conversation about what rewilding can achieve. Elsewhere, the momentum is unmistakable. In the United Kingdom, a new chapter began in 2025 when regulators issued the first license for wild beaver releases in Purbeck Heath, Dorset. For decades, beavers had been absent from English rivers, their return blocked by concerns over flooding and farmland. The Purbeck project, backed by Natural England, required careful planning, enclosed trials, water monitoring, and extensive dialogue with local communities. But the license marked a turning point, a formal embrace of beavers as ecosystem engineers, capable of restoring lost wetlands and reviving biodiversity. Similar efforts are now underway across England and Wales, with Scotland and the Czech Republic expanding their own reintroduction programs. Not all methods mirror the bold experiments of the past. Today, relocation relies on trucks, horse-drawn carts, and family releases, guided by decades of ecological research and increasingly by traditional indigenous knowledge. In Wood Buffalo, Parks Canada works alongside Dene, Cree, and Métis communities, blending scientific monitoring with practices rooted in local history. These partnerships recognize beavers not just as wildlife, but as cultural touchstones, builders whose work is woven into stories and livelihoods. The Wood Buffalo Dam, maintained and expanded by generations of beavers since the 1970s, now serves as a flagship for global rewilding. Its sheer size, more than twice the length of the Hoover Dam, offers a visible benchmark for what natural engineering can accomplish. As satellite images confirm the greening of valleys from Idaho to Alberta, the legacy of beaver restoration is spreading. Policy frameworks are shifting. Governments, agencies, and local groups are investing in beaver-based solutions to water management, climate resilience, and habitat creation. The world is watching as beavers, once nearly lost, reclaim their role as architects of living landscapes. Right now, satellites track wetlands created by beavers spreading across continents, living proof that nature, given space and time, engineers resilience at a scale humans cannot replicate. As climate risks mount, beaver restoration offers a cost-effective, proven tool for repairing land and storing carbon. Sometimes the most radical act is letting nature's oldest builders do the work. Utah's rivers are dying. 28% are too poisoned to sustain life, snowpack is melting away, and the Great Salt Lake is shrinking year after year. Then in a desperate gamble, scientists released hundreds of beavers into a desert river scorched by wildfire and heat. 6 years later, the impact was nothing short of astonishing. How did an animal once hunted as a pest achieve what millions of dollars in engineering could not? This is the story behind a transformation few believed possible. Across Utah, rivers that once carved life through the desert now struggle to survive. Statewide, more than a quarter of all rivers, 28%, are so degraded they can no longer support fish or aquatic plants. The snowpack that feeds these waterways has shrunk by 16% since 1979, and what remains melts away 9 days sooner each spring. These early melts leave streams parched through the hottest months, unable to recover before the next dry season arrives. The Great Salt Lake, a barometer for the region's entire water system, has dropped by 22 feet since 1986. Shorelines recede, salt builds up, and bird populations dwindle as wetlands vanish. Each of these numbers tells the same story. Water is disappearing faster than it can be replaced. The entire state faces a relentless decline, with once reliable rivers reduced to isolated pools and empty channels. In this environment, every drop counts, and every failed solution puts more pressure on the fragile balance between people, wildlife, and the land itself. In 2007, a lightning strike ignited the Milford Flat Fire, burning across 567 square miles of central Utah. The flames tore through everything: sagebrush, cottonwoods, willows, leaving nothing but scorched earth along the Price River's banks. Without roots to anchor the soil, the first thunderstorms that followed sent torrents of loose dirt and ash straight into the river. Sediment piled up in channels already running low, turning clear water into a muddy soup. What little flow remained slowed to a crawl, choked by debris. As summer temperatures climbed past 100 degrees Fahrenheit, the shallow, sluggish river heated quickly. In some stretches, water temperatures soared above 100 degrees, hotter than many fish can survive. Native species, already stressed by low flows, suffocated or baked in the sun-warmed pools. The once green corridor along the Price faded into bare, dusty patches. Dead trees and sun-bleached stones lined the banks where shade and life had thrived just months earlier. With each passing season, the river's ability to recover slipped further away. The damage from fire, erosion, and relentless heat left the Price River teetering on the edge of collapse, its future uncertain and its recovery looking nearly impossible. Concrete fixes came with a staggering price tag. Each artificial dam along the Price River demanded anywhere from $500,000 to $2 million, draining budgets for a solution that never lasted. Engineers poured concrete and rerouted channels, but the river's problems only deepened. Maintenance crews returned again and again, patching cracks and clearing debris while the water slipped away. Human-built beaver dam analogs, designed to mimic nature, required constant upkeep, replacing washed-out logs, rebuilding collapsed sections, and fighting erosion that never stopped. Even with the best intentions, these structures failed to create the messy, ever-changing habitats that real beavers once provided. In 2017, a University of Idaho study confirmed what locals had already witnessed. No amount of human engineering could match the adaptability or ecological impact of living beavers. Money and machinery alone couldn't bring the Price River back to life. The search for a better answer grew urgent as each expensive fix fell short. Emma Doden, a researcher at Utah State University, saw a chance to do things differently. Instead of pouring more money into concrete and machinery, her team launched the Beaver Bunkhouse program, a plan built on frugality and biology. Working with the Utah Division of Wildlife Resources and partners like the Watershed Restoration Initiative, they set out to capture beavers labeled as nuisances on farms and in neighborhoods. Each animal went through a 3-day quarantine, with health checks and microchip implants to ensure safety and long-term tracking. The process focused on keeping family groups together, boosting their odds of settling in new territory. In total, 47 beavers were relocated to struggling rivers like the Price and San Rafael, starting in 2019. The cost was just $2,000 to $3,000 per beaver pair, orders of magnitude less than even a single artificial dam. For Emma and her team, the hope was simple. Let nature's own engineers try where human fixes had failed. Predators struck within days of release. Coyotes and raptors found easy meals among beavers still dazed from transport. Some animals vanished, their radio signals lost among the rocky gullies and sagebrush. Others, driven by instinct, wandered as far as 12 miles upstream or down, searching for cooler water or thicker stands of willow. Not every beaver survived the ordeal, but the ones that did began to shape the river in ways no human project ever could. By late summer, the first muddy walls appeared along side channels. Dams, built stick by stick, held back water for the first time in decades. Pools deepened behind these new barriers, and trickles of water spread sideways into the dry banks. The odds had seemed stacked against the beavers from the start, yet their determination left a mark. Even with losses and long journeys, enough families settled in to begin the slow work of healing the river. Each dam was a foothold in a place most had written off as hopeless. Within 6 years of the first beaver releases, the Price River's entire hydrology began to change. Where water once rushed unchecked, flow slowed from 3 feet per second to just over half that speed, measured at 1.6 feet per second behind the new dams. Pools formed, spreading water across the floodplain and soaking deep into the ground. The cracked, sun-baked riverbanks softened as ponds held back sediment that used to wash downstream with every storm. Groundwater monitors recorded a rise of 3 to 5 feet within 50 meters of active beaver dams, enough to bring moisture back to roots that had not seen water in years. This was not a single event, but a steady transformation, tracked season by season from 2019 through 2025. Beavers, working without blueprints or budgets, rewired the river's flow and revived a system that human engineering had failed to fix. Fish returned first, darting through deeper pools where only stagnant puddles had existed. Mayflies and caddisflies hatched in numbers not seen in a generation, drawing swallows and bats to feast at dusk. Frogs and salamanders reappeared in the new wetlands, their calls echoing across the water. By 2022, 6.2 miles of the Price River supported this revival, a living corridor where wildlife flourished. Even wildfires, once unstoppable in the dry brush, lost their grip. Scientists found that areas shaped by beaver ponds lost only 1/3 as much vegetation during burns compared to stretches without them. The beavers' work rippled outward, building not just dams, but an entire network of resilience. Each new species that returned added another link, turning a barren riverbed into a thriving ecosystem that could withstand the harshest tests of drought and fire. Helper, Utah, once watched its river dwindle to little more than a memory. By 2025, the Salt Lake Tribune reported that the Price River's revival had helped save our Utah town. Locals now spend summer afternoons kayaking and fishing where only mud and rocks remained a decade earlier. Farmers downstream talk about the difference in their fields as water held back by beaver ponds arrives when crops need it most. Restaurants and shops in town bustle with visitors, drawn by the promise of wildlife and cool water in the heart of the desert. The same beavers once trapped as pests are now at the center of a thriving recreation economy, their dams quietly supporting both livelihoods and landscapes. For the people who live here, the return of water brought back not just the river, but a sense of hope that had been missing for years. Beavers turned a dying river into a living system at a fraction of the cost of artificial fixes. As Utah's snowpack shrinks and water crises deepen, nature's engineers remind us that restoration is still possible if we let it be wild. Sometimes resilience starts with a single ripple. Before New York's skyline rose, the harbor hid 220,000 acres of oyster reefs so vast that Dutch ships steered wide around Manhattan to avoid running aground. Generations lived on their abundance until overharvest and sewage blackened the water and erased the reefs by 1927, turning a global food capital into an open sewer. In 2014, scientists, students, and skeptics gambled on restoring millions of oysters to these poisoned tides. But what really happens to a city's identity and its future? When you try to rebuild a sunken empire shell by shell, the answer is far messier and far more revealing than anyone imagined. Long before concrete and steel, New York Harbor was defined by something quieter but far more powerful: oysters. The scale almost defies belief. 220,000 acres of living reefs stretched across the estuary, a submerged landscape so dense that ships arriving from Europe had to plot careful courses to avoid grounding on their jagged edges. For the Lenape, these reefs were more than a food source. Generations gathered oysters in the shallows, stacking their discarded shells into middens that still surface in archaeological digs across Staten Island and the Bronx. Each layer tells a story of seasonal harvests, communal feasts, and rituals tied to the tides. Oysters shaped the city's earliest economy. Dutch settlers arriving in the 17th century found the harbor teeming with shellfish. They mapped shipping lanes around the reefs and soon began dredging channels to make way for commerce. The shells themselves became building material, crushed for mortar, piled up to expand the shoreline, and even used as currency in trade. By the 19th century, oysters had become New York's signature dish, sold by the bucket on street corners and served in every tavern from the Bowery to Broadway. The city earned a reputation as the oyster capital of the world. The reefs did more than feed a growing metropolis. They filtered the harbor's water, each oyster straining out plankton and sediment and helping to keep the estuary clear. Tangled clusters of shells created shelter for fish, crabs, and shrimp, drawing a web of marine life close to shore. During storms, the reefs broke the force of incoming waves, protecting the fragile edge of Manhattan from erosion and flooding. For centuries, this living infrastructure allowed both people and wildlife to thrive side by side. Evidence of this abundance is found not just in old maps and city records, but in the ground itself. Layers of oyster shells, some several meters thick, mark the sites of ancient feasts and colonial expansion. Early Dutch maps show reefs as navigational hazards, while city planners used oyster shells to build out the Battery and to line the foundations of new neighborhoods. Even today, the bones of that lost empire lie beneath the city's streets and parks, a silent record of a time when the harbor's riches seemed endless. By the late 19th century, oysters had become so woven into daily life that their absence was unthinkable. The city's appetite seemed boundless, and the reefs, vast as they were, felt inexhaustible. But beneath the surface, the balance that had held for thousands of years was beginning to slip. Oyster reefs that once seemed endless began to vanish in a matter of decades. By the turn of the 20th century, the city's appetite for oysters had outpaced nature's ability to replenish them. Harvesters scraped the beds bare, dredging deeper and farther with every passing year. The reefs, once thick enough to block ships, shrank to scattered remnants. But overfishing was only the beginning. As New York's population exploded, the harbor became the city's dumping ground. Untreated sewage, industrial waste, and runoff poured into the water day after day. Combined sewer overflows sent torrents of stormwater and raw waste into the estuary with every heavy rain. The water, once clear enough to see the bottom, turned murky and foul. Oxygen levels dropped, suffocating marine life. Parasites and disease swept through the remaining oyster beds, killing off what little survived. By the 1920s, the consequences were impossible to ignore. Oysters pulled from the harbor grew smaller and sicklier each season. Shellfish illnesses spiked, and cases of food poisoning traced to local oysters made headlines. In 1927, health officials took drastic action. The last commercial oyster grounds in New York Harbor were ordered shut. Shellfish from these waters were declared unsafe to eat. For the first time in centuries, the city's most iconic food disappeared from its own shoreline. The ban was not just a blow to the economy. It was an admission that the harbor had become too dangerous for even the hardiest species to survive. The stigma stuck. Newspapers and city officials began to call the harbor an open sewer. The phrase captured the public's sense of loss and disgust. What had once been a symbol of abundance and resilience now stood as a warning. The water was considered nearly dead. For decades, the only signs of life were the swirling currents of waste and the occasional scavenger picking through the filth. The city turned its back on the waterfront, building walls and highways to keep the stench and memory at bay. The collapse of the oyster reefs was not a slow fade, it was a crash. A sudden and public unraveling of a relationship that had shaped the city from its earliest days. The harbor's fall from grace was complete. Its transformation from engine of abundance to environmental cautionary tale was written in headlines and health department warnings. In 1972, the rules for New York Harbor changed overnight. The Clean Water Act, passed by Congress that year, made it illegal to dump untreated sewage into American waterways. For decades, the city's waste had flowed directly into the estuary, clouding the water and choking out nearly all marine life. Now, federal law demanded a new approach. New York began the slow, expensive work of building wastewater treatment plants. Concrete tanks and underground pipes took shape across the boroughs, designed to capture and clean the torrents that once emptied straight into the harbor. The results did not appear immediately. Years of pollution could not be erased in a single season. But over time, the water began to clear. Fish that had vanished from the city's memory started to return to forgotten inlets and piers. In the early 2000s, scientists and curious locals discovered something unexpected: wild oysters clinging to old pilings and rocky outcrops. These scattered survivors were not enough to revive the lost reefs, but they proved that the harbor's wounds were not beyond healing. The Clean Water Act did not restore the ecosystem by itself, but it forced a shift in how the city treated its water and its shoreline. The law cracked open a door that had been closed for generations, making it possible to imagine a future where oysters and the life they supported could return to New York Harbor. In 2014, two educators, Pete Malinowski and Murray Fisher, stood on Governor's Island with a vision that seemed almost impossible: to restore 1 billion oysters to New York Harbor. The harbor, once written off as lifeless, became their classroom and laboratory. The first step was as gritty as it was ambitious. Students from the harbor school began hauling buckets of discarded oyster shells from restaurants across Manhattan and Brooklyn. Each shell, scraped clean and stacked in sunlit curing yards, became a building block for the future. By the end of that first year, the project had collected over 100,000 pounds of shells, enough to form a mountain of possibility. The process was hands-on from the start. Students learned to seed each shell with microscopic oyster larvae, bred in tanks just yards from the water's edge. The work demanded patience and precision. Larvae no bigger than a grain of sand had to be coaxed to settle on the shells and begin their transformation. Once ready, the shells were loaded into cages and reef balls, then ferried out into the harbor's murky shallows. Every shell seeded was a vote of confidence in the harbor's recovery and in the people betting on it. The Billion Oyster Project was not just about numbers. It was about proving that restoration could be driven by students and volunteers, not only by scientists in distant labs. The 1 billion goal set the bar high, but it gave every participant a stake in the outcome. What began as an experiment in education quickly became a citywide movement, fueled by hope, hard labor, and the belief that New York's harbor could still be reborn. Permits piled up faster than oyster shells. Every new reef demanded a stack of paperwork. City, state, and federal agencies each required their own forms, reviews, and signatures. In New Jersey, a poaching scare had triggered a blanket ban on oyster restoration in polluted waters, casting a shadow across the entire estuary. Regulators on both sides of the Hudson wanted guarantees: no harvesting, no shortcuts, and no risk of shellfish ending up on dinner plates. The rules were strict, and the scrutiny was constant. Students and volunteers found themselves acting as both scientists and compliance officers. Underwater cameras tracked each cage. RFID tags logged the movement and growth of oysters, creating a digital trail for every reef. Warning signs in bright colors dotted the shoreline, spelling out in plain language that these oysters were not for eating. Every step was monitored, measured, and reported back to agencies wary of any misstep. Skepticism ran deep. Some officials dismissed the entire effort as a science fair stunt, a well-meaning but naive experiment that could never bring real change to a harbor this damaged. To many in power, the idea of students and teachers restoring a lost ecosystem sounded more like wishful thinking than a genuine solution. Yet the work continued, reef by reef, shell by shell, with each new hurdle forcing the team to become more resourceful and determined. The stakes were clear. If the project failed, it would not just set back restoration, it would reinforce the belief that New York Harbor was beyond saving. In the heart of Hudson River Park, the experiment moved from hope to hard data. Scientists and students lowered clusters of concrete reef balls and wire gabions seeded with millions of oysters spat into the river's currents. The results were impossible to ignore. Within 3 years, more than 35 million spat had settled onto these structures, transforming bare substrate into living reef. Survey dives brought back images of blue crabs, oyster toadfish, mud snails, and delicate shrimp weaving through the growing oyster clusters. The reef balls themselves supported 32 different species, while the gabion cages hosted 37, a diversity that had vanished from these waters for generations. But the most surprising proof surfaced farther upriver at the Tappan Zee site. Here, researchers left sections of bare shell and rock, with no hatchery raised spat added. The question was simple: could the harbor's wild oyster larvae, drifting unseen in the water, find and colonize these blank slates? The answer came in the form of a boom. 5.8 million wild oysters settled naturally, without human intervention. For the first time in living memory, the river produced a spontaneous generation of oysters, a sign that water quality and ecological conditions had crossed a threshold. Marine scientists who had spent decades tracking the harbor's decline now found themselves tallying species lists and oyster counts that would have been unthinkable just a decade earlier. The reefs functioned as more than just oyster nurseries. They filtered water, provided shelter, and rebuilt the food web from the ground up. Each new survey revealed more evidence: juvenile fish darting between shells, tiny shrimp clinging to the reef matrix, blue crabs staking out territory among the clusters. The data told a clear story. Given the right structure and a chance to recover, New York Harbor's ecosystem could begin to heal itself. The experiment had become evidence, and the skeptics had to reckon with results measured not in promises, but in living reefs. Measured by any standard, the restoration has reached a scale few would have predicted. Today, more than 130 million live oysters anchor nearly 19 acres of reef scattered throughout the harbor, a living network roughly the size of 14 football fields. Over 2 million pounds of shells, once destined for landfill, now serve as the backbone of these habitats, each shell layered with new life and possibility. But the numbers, impressive as they are, tell only part of the story. Beneath the surface, the work remains fragile. Oysters face threats that statistics alone cannot capture. Disease is a constant adversary. Pathogens like dermo and MSX, nearly invisible but devastating, can sweep through a population in a single season, leaving empty shells where thriving clusters had been. In some years, entire reefs have suffered sudden die-offs, victims of microscopic invaders that thrive in warming, stressed waters. Each outbreak forces a reckoning. As scientists and engineers scramble to adapt, they have shifted from traditional reef structures to modular cages, placing oysters deeper in the water column where temperatures are more stable and disease pressure eases, at least for a time. The city's infrastructure brings its own risks. Combined sewer overflows, triggered by heavy rains, still pour untreated waste into the harbor. After major storms, the water can turn hostile overnight, exposing reefs to pollution pulses that set back months of growth. Dock failures and heat waves have wiped out large sections of carefully seeded oysters, pushing engineers to redesign moorings and experiment with more resilient placements. Each setback is a reminder that even with new technology and decades of learning, restoration in a living city is never simple. Strict no-harvest rules remain in force. Despite cleaner water and growing reefs, these oysters cannot be eaten. Regulators insist on constant monitoring, RFID tagging, and warning signs at every site. The reefs are built for habitat, water filtration, and shoreline protection, not for harvest. The project's success is measured in ecological function, not in bushels hauled to market. Oysters alone cannot solve every problem facing the harbor. They complement, but do not replace, the city's $45 billion investment in wastewater upgrades. Each living reef is a step toward recovery, but the work is ongoing and always at risk. The story of New York's oysters is not a simple comeback, but a lesson in persistence, where every gain is hard-won and every season brings new challenges. Right now, over 130 million live oysters filter New York's harbor. That is proof that ecological repair is possible, even in the shadow of a metropolis. Yet every new reef faces threats from disease, pollution, and climate extremes. Restoration is not a finish line. It is an ongoing pact with the water. Beneath the surface of New York Harbor, volunteers scrub discarded oyster shells, working toward a goal no city has ever attempted, placing 1 billion oysters back into these polluted waters to reverse a century of devastation. In 1609, this was the world's most bountiful shellfish paradise until overfishing and industrial waste killed everything. Now, against all odds, life is returning. But what does it take for an ecosystem declared dead to rise again? And why trust oysters to save America's biggest city? Gloved hands plunge into piles of sun-bleached oyster shells, scrubbing away grit and stray bits of seaweed. On Governor's Island, the air smells of salt and limestone, and laughter carries across the curing yard. Families, students, retirees, and first-timers gather around long tables working side by side. Some arrive by ferry from Brooklyn or Manhattan, others by bike, all drawn by the promise of restoring life to the harbor. The task is simple but relentless. Each shell must be cleaned, sorted, and stacked, destined to become the foundation for a new reef. The scale is staggering. Buckets fill, barrels empty, and still the shells keep coming. Over 75 restaurants across New York City save every shucked oyster shell from their kitchens, sending them here instead of to the landfill. Each shell spends a year outdoors, weathered by sun, rain, and snow, until it is safe to return to the water. Volunteers move through the curing yard in a steady rhythm, scraping, rinsing, passing shells down the line. Children compete to see who can clean the most in an hour. A grandmother shows her grandson how to spot a shell big enough for a baby oyster to call home. No one here will see the full result of their labor today. The shells they clean will not be seeded with oyster larvae until next season. Still, every participant knows they are part of something bigger, a citywide effort with a deadline, and a number that seems almost impossible. 1 billion oysters by 2035. That is the target. Each shell in a volunteer's hand is a step toward it. The work is repetitive, but the goal is anything but routine. A project on this scale is more than logistics and numbers. It is a movement that draws strength from the people who show up, week after week, to do the work no machine can replicate. The volunteers come from every borough, every background. Some are drawn by curiosity, others by the memory of a cleaner harbor told by older relatives. For many, it is a way to reclaim a connection to the water that once defined New York's identity. As the sun starts to dip behind the skyline, the pile of cleaned shells grows higher. The day's effort will soon be measured in tons, but for those who spent hours with their hands in the shells, the impact is measured in pride and hope. The harbor's future is being rebuilt, one shell at a time, by thousands of ordinary New Yorkers who refuse to give up on their city's water. The memory of what was lost lingers in the background, but here in the present, the work is all about what can still be restored. In September of 1609, Henry Hudson's ship sailed into a harbor unlike any other on the continent. Below the water's surface, oyster reefs sprawled across more than 220,000 acres, an expanse larger than the city itself. The reefs rose in jagged mounds, some so high that navigators marked them as hazards on their charts. Oysters were everywhere, anchoring the harbor's food web, filtering the tides, and softening the blow of every storm that rolled in from the Atlantic. For centuries, oysters shaped life in New York. They were the city's original street food, piled high on carts along bustling avenues, eaten by the rich and working class alike. Shells paved the alleys, filled the foundations of grand buildings, and lined the tables of every tavern. The reefs themselves teemed with life, fish, crabs, and birds finding shelter in the labyrinth of shells, while the water ran clear enough for sunlight to reach the harbor floor. But abundance bred carelessness. As the city grew, its appetite for oysters became insatiable. By the early 1800s, commercial harvesters were pulling billions from the water each year, shipping them by the barrel to distant cities. The demand for lime to build and pave New York's streets meant that not just the meat, but the shells themselves were carted away, ground up, and lost forever. Industry followed. Factories lined the waterfront, their pipes pouring chemical waste and dyes directly into the estuary. The city's swelling population brought new waves of pollution. Untreated sewage flowed from tenements and row houses, turning the harbor into a dumping ground. Dredges flattened ancient reefs to deepen shipping lanes, erasing the three-dimensional structures that had taken thousands of years to build. Within a single human lifetime, the harbor's vast oyster beds began to vanish. By the late 1800s, the reefs that once covered the bay were reduced to scattered remnants. Water that had run clear turned murky and foul. The last commercial beds struggled on, but contamination grew worse with every year. In 1927, health officials ordered the final oyster grounds closed. The harbor, once one of the most productive estuaries on Earth, was declared biologically dead. What was lost was not just a delicacy or a way of life, but the very foundation of the harbor's ecosystem. The reefs that had filtered the tides, sheltered marine life, and protected the shoreline were gone. In less than a century, New York had destroyed 220,000 acres of living reef, a collapse measured not in headlines, but in silence. The water grew still, and the memory of abundance faded. Yet beneath the city's relentless drive, the harbor waited, empty but not forgotten, for someone to imagine what might be possible again. Pete Malinowski grew up with salt in his blood. On Fisher's Island, his family farmed oysters the old way, by hand, tide after tide, no shortcuts. He learned early that an oyster's work is slow, invisible, and relentless. That lesson stayed with him through college and followed him to New York City, where the water was darker, the stakes higher, and the memory of abundance almost gone. Years later, standing on the battered piers of Governor's Island, Pete met Murray Fisher. Murray had founded the New York Harbor School with a stubborn belief: give young people real responsibility and they will rise to it. He wanted a school where the harbor itself was the classroom, where students did not just read about restoration but did it. Pete signed on as an aquaculture teacher, and together they started asking questions nobody else dared. Why not bring oysters back? Why not trust teenagers to help lead the way? The idea sounded naive, even reckless. City officials and scientists doubted oysters could survive in water still haunted by a century of waste. Pete heard it all: too dirty, too ambitious, too slow for a city obsessed with quick fixes. But he remembered his family's farm, where patience and persistence paid off in every harvest. He saw the same grit in his students' faces as they hauled cages and measured salinity, undeterred by setbacks or skepticism. Murray pushed for partnerships, grants, and city support, while Pete focused on the science, testing, failing, adapting, and trying again. Their first pilot reefs were small, more hope than proof. Still, each surviving oyster was a quiet rebuke to the doubters. The project grew, not because it was easy, but because Pete and Murray refused to accept that New York's harbor was beyond saving. Pete once said that if you want to teach someone to care about the water, you have to let them get their hands dirty. For him, restoration was never just about oysters or numbers. It was about giving people, especially kids, a reason to believe they could change their city, one shell and one season at a time. An oyster spends its life doing a job no machine can match. Each adult oyster draws water in through its gills, trapping tiny particles of algae, silt, and even pollutants in a sticky layer of mucus. What most people see as a shellfish is, in fact, a natural filtration engine, one that can process up to 50 gallons of water every single day. Multiply that by 1 billion, and the scale of transformation becomes almost impossible to ignore. The process is deceptively simple. Water flows through the oyster's body, and as it passes, suspended particles are removed. Nitrogen, a pollutant that fuels algae blooms and dead zones, is locked away inside the oyster's shell and tissue. This is not a temporary fix. Once incorporated, that nitrogen is out of circulation for good. The oyster's metabolism turns what would be waste into growth, and the shells themselves become permanent records of the harbor's changing chemistry. As more water is filtered, clarity improves. Sunlight, once blocked by clouds of suspended sediment, reaches the harbor floor for the first time in decades. Seagrass begins to grow again, laying down roots and providing both oxygen and refuge for young fish and crabs. The benefits ripple outward. Clearer water supports more life, and more life helps keep the water clean. This is the cascade effect at work. A single oyster's effort multiplied across an entire city's shoreline. Beyond filtration, oyster reefs build structure where there was only mud. The shells pile up, layer upon layer, creating a three-dimensional habitat that shelters hundreds of species. Small fish dart among the crevices, while larger predators patrol the edges. What was once a barren bottom becomes a living reef, as complex and vital as any coral garden in warmer seas. This is why the idea works. Not because oysters are exotic or rare, but because they are relentless, efficient, and perfectly suited to the job. Their biology is the blueprint for restoration. Not just cleaning water, but rebuilding the very foundation of an ecosystem. In the city's kitchens, the workday ends with a ritual that is easy to overlook. At Grand Central Oyster Bar, and at more than 75 restaurants across New York, staff scrape shells from plates, pile them into blue bins, and set them aside. These shells will not head to the landfill. Instead, they begin a journey that threads through the city's streets, across the harbor, and back into the water. Trucks collect the day's haul and ferry it to Governor's Island, where the shells are stacked in open-air curing yards, exposed to the elements for a full year. Rain, sun, and winter cold break down any lingering flesh or bacteria, transforming what was once waste into the raw material for restoration. This is more than a recycling program. It is a supply chain with a purpose. The year-long curing process is not just tradition. It is a strict public health requirement set by state and federal regulators to ensure no pathogens survive. Only after this waiting period, when the shells are clean and safe, can they be seeded with oyster larvae and returned to the harbor. People ask, can you eat these oysters? The answer is no. These reefs are off limits for harvest. They exist to clean water, not to fill plates. The rules are clear. Restored oysters are for the ecosystem, not the menu. Once the shells are ready, the next hands to touch them often belong to teenagers in rubber boots. Over 10,000 students from the Urban Assembly New York Harbor School and partner programs have worked the line, measuring, sorting, and preparing shells for the hatchery. In labs and on boats, students learn to rear oyster larvae, monitor water quality, and build reef structures that will survive the city's tides. What starts as a biology lesson quickly becomes a lesson in logistics, teamwork, and patience. The process is slow, but the scale is massive. Each year, thousands of pounds of shells move from restaurant tables to reef sites in all 5 boroughs. This closed loop, restaurant, curing yard, classroom, harbor, proves that restoration can be built into the fabric of everyday life. It is not just scientists or environmentalists driving the change. It is chefs, dishwashers, drivers, students, and teachers, all linked by the simple act of saving a shell. The city's appetite, once a force of destruction, now powers a supply chain that rebuilds the harbor, one meal and one lesson at a time. Survey divers slip beneath the surface, notebooks strapped to their wrists, counting oysters by the thousands. The numbers tell a story no one could have imagined a decade ago. More than 150 million oysters now anchor the harbor floor, spread across 17 acres of restored reef. Each spring and summer, crews seed another 50 million, tracking survival rates and growth, measuring progress site by site. The reefs are more than statistics, they are living structures, layered with new life. Fish school in the shadows, crabs scuttle between shells, and the water above grows clearer with every season. Divers record the return of species once missing from these waters, evidence that the experiment is working. Every data point, every shell counted, is proof that a city's faith in nature can be rewarded. The harbor's recovery is no longer a distant hope. It is happening, one oyster, 1 acre, and one survey at a time. After Hurricane Sandy battered Staten Island in 2012, the search for better storm protection took on new urgency. Instead of building more concrete walls, planners turned to an idea rooted in the harbor's own history: living breakwaters. Backed by a $60 million grant from the Department of Housing and Urban Development, engineers and ecologists designed a chain of oyster-encrusted reefs stretching along the Tottenville shoreline. These breakwaters are not just habitat, they are infrastructure. Computer models and field tests show they can reduce wave energy by as much as 80% during storms, softening the impact before water reaches homes and streets. The price tag for this kind of resilience is striking. Building living breakwaters costs about 1/3 as much as traditional seawalls and comes with none of the maintenance headaches of concrete. For Staten Island residents, the calculation is simple. Every dollar spent on oysters and reef balls buys not just cleaner water, but a safer, more stable coastline, one that can adapt to rising seas and fiercer storms without sacrificing the life of the harbor. Maya Rivera grew up in the Bronx, just blocks from a stretch of river once written off as hopeless. She joined the harbor school as a freshman, unsure of her path but drawn to the promise of hands-on work. 4 years later, she graduated with a certification in marine science and a job offer from a research lab studying urban estuaries. Maya's story is not unusual here. Over a decade, thousands of students have followed the same current, from classroom to harbor, from curiosity to career. Their work has rippled outward. Neighborhoods once fenced off from the water now host kayak launches and fishing piers. Families gather on weekends to explore tide pools that did not exist a few years ago. The project's impact has caught the eye of city officials from Tokyo, London, and Cape Town, all eager to learn how a city can restore its waterfront by investing in its people. In New York, the harbor's comeback is measured not just in oysters, but in lives changed. Right now, New York's reefs are growing back, filtering millions of gallons every day, proof that restoration can outpace destruction. As sea levels rise and cities search for resilient solutions, nature's own engineers quietly rebuild the harbor's future. It began when a volunteer found a snake on the roadside, its mouth crawling with white segmented parasites no Floridian had ever documented before. Native snakes, some harboring over 100 of these blood-feeding intruders in their lungs, are dying in waves. The killer is an invasive parasite from Asia, evolving unchecked, already spilling north toward Alabama and Georgia. How did this hidden invader escape from pet trade pythons, and what will stop its advance? The parasite at the center of this crisis has a name: Rhylietiella orientalis. It is not a worm, but a pentastum, a crustacean relative that looks more like a segmented white thread with hook-like mouthparts than anything native to North America. Under the microscope, its body reveals armored rings and a set of chitinous hooks, perfect for latching onto the delicate lining inside a snake's lungs. This organism's story does not begin in Florida. Its roots stretch across Southeast Asia and Africa, where it evolved alongside a range of reptile hosts, including the Burmese python. In those native ecosystems, pythons and the parasite have reached a truce. The snake's large lungs and slow metabolism allow them to survive heavy infestations with little harm. But the 1990s brought a new chapter. Waves of Burmese pythons entered Florida through the exotic pet trade. Some were released intentionally, others escaped. Each python carried more than just its own threat. Many harbored Rillietiella orientalis deep within their lungs, invisible to import inspections. The parasite's eggs and larvae traveled with these snakes, hidden from view, until the pythons found their way into the wilds of South Florida. It was only years later that herpetologists like Dr. Kelsey Chapman would open up the lungs of a dying native snake and find these segmented invaders for the first time. The discovery turned a local mystery into a clear threat, revealing that the parasite had leapt from its python reservoir and was now loose in Florida's native snake populations. The question shifted from what it was to how it would change everything for the snakes that had never encountered it before. Inside the lungs of a native Florida snake, the devastation is immediate and unmistakable. Adult Rillietiella orientalis can reach nearly 4 inches in length, their pale, segmented bodies packed tightly together, writhing among the delicate folds of lung tissue. Clinical necropsies have revealed scenes that border on the surreal. Lungs so densely filled with parasites make normal breathing impossible. In one documented case, a pygmy rattlesnake was found with 107 pentastomes occupying its lungs. The massive parasites fed directly on the snake's blood, leaving behind raw lesions, inflamed tissue, and pockets of pus. Lungs meant for drawing in air are reduced to a battleground of blood and infection. As the infestation worsens, snakes become weak, stop eating, and struggle to move. Starvation and suffocation set in. The final stages are especially graphic. As the dying snake gasps for air, adult parasites can be seen emerging from the mouth, searching for a new host even as their current one slips away. This is not a slow decline. The damage is so severe that pneumonia and sepsis often follow, overwhelming the snake's system. For many native species, there is no chance to recover. The internal carnage caused by Rillietiella orientalis is not just a biological curiosity, it is a lethal force, turning vital organs into breeding grounds for death. The scale and intensity of these infections prove the threat is not cosmetic or rare. It is lethal, and it is spreading. The life of Rillietiella orientalis doesn't end with the death of a snake. As the adult parasites feed and breed inside the lungs, their eggs are coughed up or swallowed, finally leaving the host in feces. That is where the relay begins. Coprophagous insects, especially cockroaches, swarm to the droppings and ingest the microscopic eggs. Inside these insects, the eggs hatch and develop into infectious larvae, quietly waiting for the next link in the chain. Lizards and frogs, some native and others invasive like the brown anole, become accidental couriers. As they hunt for insects, they eat the infected cockroaches. The larvae slip into their bodies, nestling into tissues and lying dormant, sometimes for months. These paratenic hosts show little sign of illness, moving freely across habitats, carrying the parasite far beyond the original infection site. In laboratory studies, brown anoles fed infected roach tissue harbored viable larvae for over 150 days, showing how easily the cycle endures. When a snake, drawn by movement in the leaf litter, swallows a lizard or frog, the dormant larvae spring to life. They migrate through the snake's body and settle in the lungs, where they mature and start the process again. This multi-stage journey, relying on common insects and ubiquitous prey, means the parasite no longer depends on pythons to survive. Every step, egg, insect, lizard, snake, creates new opportunities for the parasite to leap into fresh hosts, making eradication nearly impossible. Field technicians tracking these hosts find evidence of the parasite's reach in nearly every layer of the ecosystem, showing a cycle that is both resilient and relentless. Florida's map tells the story in numbers. By the mid-2010s, the parasite's reach was limited to the southern tip, just a handful of counties clustered around the Everglades. Today, confirmed infections stretch across more than 34 counties, with the parasite now entrenched in the state's north, central, and panhandle regions. Roadkill surveys, organized by the Snake Lungworm Alliance and known as SLAM, have become the backbone of tracking this expansion. Teams collect dead snakes from highways and rural roads, documenting species, location, and infection status. Each year, the tally grows. What started as isolated discoveries in southern black racers and cottonmouths now includes coach whips, banded water snakes, pygmy rattlesnakes, and the federally threatened eastern indigo snake. The data show a relentless advance northward, averaging over 20 miles per year. In Alachua County, a banded water snake found in 2019 carried a heavy load of parasites, hundreds of kilometers beyond the python's original range. By 2023, black racers with visible lungworm infections turned up in St. Johns County, just south of the Georgia line. GIS analysis and field reports confirm at least 18 native species harboring the parasite, with new hosts added as surveys expand. The breadth of infected species and the speed of expansion confirm this is not a localized outbreak. It is an epidemic, and every new county added to the map means another step closer to the borders of Alabama and Georgia. For researchers, the numbers are alarming. The parasite no longer needs pythons or the pet trade. It is moving under its own power, carried by native wildlife through every corner of Florida. A volunteer roadkill surveyor combing a two-lane highway just south of the Alabama border recalls the moment a necropsy revealed something new inside a native black racer. The segmented bodies matched those found in Florida, confirming the parasite had crossed state lines. In Alabama, 2024 samples sent to university labs returned positive for Rayleigh orientalis, setting off alarm among regional biologists. Georgia, meanwhile, remains on high alert. No confirmed cases yet, but surveillance teams are ramping up roadside collections and necropsies. The steady northward march, once limited to Florida's wetlands, now threatens to breach the entire southeast. With climate and host species nearly identical across state borders, the conditions are set for the parasite's next leap. For conservationists, every new detection is more than a data point. It is a warning that the crisis is no longer confined to a single state. Across Florida, the disappearance of native snakes is already being felt in unexpected ways. As these predators vanish, rodent populations are poised to surge, threatening crops and spreading disease. Food web models warn that unchecked rodent growth could ripple through farms and wildlands alike. The threat does not stop at rare species. Every lost snake leaves a gap in the ecosystem. With no treatment or cure, the only defense is vigilance. The Snake Lungworm Alliance, known as SLAM, urges anyone who finds a sick or dead snake, especially if worms are visible in the mouth, to report it through their online portal. Citizen science is now the front line. Every report helps scientists track the outbreak and protect what remains of the Southeast's native wildlife. Today, native snakes face an invisible threat, still spreading across the Southeast. With no known barrier and no available treatment, the region's ecological balance hangs in the balance. Each mile the parasite advances, another species risks silent collapse. A group of Nevada farmers dumped millions of bees straight onto the desert's salt crust. No hives, no boxes, just bare earth. Agricultural experts called it insane, but 1 month later, those same barren fields were at the center of a crop pollination breakthrough, now responsible for a quarter of America's alfalfa seed. How did a desperate gamble in the dust change the fate of an entire industry, and what secret did those purple blooms still keep? The answer begins in the very heart of the pollination crisis. Each alfalfa flower hides a secret beneath its purple petals. At the center sits a tightly folded keel, a structure formed by fused petals that acts as a protective shield for the plant's pollen and reproductive organs. To release its pollen, the flower demands a specific action: something must press down hard enough on the keel. When that pressure is just right, the keel snaps upward, striking the visiting insect with a quick slap and coating it in pollen. It is a clever defense and delivery system all in one. But for most pollinators, this mechanism is more trouble than reward. Honeybees brought in by the thousands learn quickly to avoid the flower's trap. After a few sharp hits to the head, they start sidestepping the whole process. Instead of pushing down on the keel, they pierce the side of the flower to steal nectar, leaving the pollen locked away and the flower unfertilized. The result is a field full of blossoms, but nearly empty seed pods. Without the right pollinator willing to trigger the keel, acres of alfalfa remain just a show of color. No seed, no harvest, no payoff. The problem is not the number of bees or the number of flowers. It is a tiny, stubborn piece of plant engineering that keeps the whole system from working unless a pollinator can crack the code. Honeybees arrived in boxes stacked high on the edge of the fields, their hives humming with life. Growers hoped these imports would solve their pollination crisis, but the reality inside the alfalfa stands told a different story. After just a few encounters with the flower's snapping keel, honeybees started to change their tactics. Instead of landing squarely on the blooms, they learned to slip around the sides, avoiding the slap and sipping nectar through tiny holes they chewed in the petals. This clever side robbing let them feed without ever touching the pollen. The result was a field alive with bees, but starved for seed. Farmers watched as acres of purple blossoms faded into empty pods. The numbers were impossible to ignore. Seed yields dropped so low that entire harvests barely covered the cost of the bees themselves. Contracts were missed, loan payments fell behind, and every season ended with the same question: why weren't the flowers setting seed? It wasn't for lack of effort. Some tried doubling the number of hives, hoping brute force would turn the tide. Others experimented with different bee breeds, but the outcome never changed. Honeybees simply refused to do the one thing the crop needed most. In meetings and at kitchen tables, frustration took root. The old solutions weren't working. Something had to give, or the valley's alfalfa fields would become a graveyard of wasted color and broken hopes. For growers, the need for a new answer became impossible to ignore. In the early 1950s, a quiet revolution began in the fields and laboratories of Washington State University. Entomologists and agricultural scientists, confronted by the stubborn failure of honeybees to pollinate alfalfa, turned their attention to the landscape itself. While farmers struggled with empty seed pods and disappointing harvests, researchers started to notice something unusual on the fringes of the valley: wild ground-nesting bees thriving in salty, barren patches of soil. These bees, later identified as Nomia melanderi, the alkali bee, seemed undeterred by the alfalfa flower's tricky keel. Instead of avoiding the snap, they landed with confidence, triggering the mechanism and collecting pollen in the process. Field trials at Washington State University confirmed what the researchers suspected. Where alkali bees were abundant, alfalfa seed yields soared. The bees' willingness to work the flowers, taking the hit, gathering pollen, and moving on, set them apart from every other pollinator tested. Unlike honeybees, alkali bees showed no hesitation. Each female worked alone but nested in dense aggregations, tunneling into the salty soil and building hidden cities beneath the crust. Their metallic stripes and smaller size made them easy to distinguish from honeybees, but it was their behavior that truly mattered. Archival reports from the university's entomology department documented the difference in seed set between fields with and without alkali bees. In some cases, yields were several times higher when these native pollinators were present. The scientists realized that the answer to the valley's pollination crisis had been there all along, hidden in the overlooked corners of the landscape. The challenge was no longer just about finding the right bee, but about understanding and recreating the conditions that allowed them to flourish. The discovery of Nomia melanderi's role in alfalfa pollination gave the scientific community a new direction. It was no longer a matter of importing more hives or breeding tougher honeybees. Instead, the focus shifted to the soil, the salt, and the native species perfectly adapted to both. This insight would lay the groundwork for a new kind of partnership between agriculture and the natural world, a partnership built on careful observation and respect for the tiny engineers already at work. Turning farmland into a home for wild bees demanded a kind of thinking that ran against every farming instinct. Instead of coaxing crops from the earth, growers began by pouring salt onto the soil, enough to whiten the ground and keep nearly everything else from growing. The numbers were staggering, about 22 tons of rock salt per acre, spread evenly across ground that could have grown wheat or hay. To outsiders, it looked like sabotage. But beneath that crust, something far more deliberate was taking shape. The next step was water, not on the surface, but underground. Crews dug down, carving shallow beds that would hold moisture below the reach of the summer sun. Into these trenches went layers of washed gravel, forming a hidden reservoir. Perforated PVC pipes, laid out in a web about 1 foot beneath the final surface, allowed water to be added or drained with precision. The pipes were not just for irrigation, they controlled the subtle balance between wet and dry that alkali bees need to survive. Too much water and the nests would flood. Too little, and the soil would bake hard, driving the bees away. Above the gravel, the soil was rebuilt layer by layer. Silty loam, low in clay, was chosen for its ability to hold moisture, yet remain easy for bees to dig. Each lift was packed just enough to prevent settling, but not so tight it would become a barrier. As the surface neared final grade, more salt was raked in, forming a crust that would slow evaporation and maintain the underground damp. The finished bed looked barren, pale and crusted and silent, but probes sunk into the soil showed a narrow band of perfect moisture, just where the bees would want it. This was not a matter of luck or guesswork. Soil scientists measured electrical conductivity and tracked water movement through the profile, adjusting salt and moisture until the conditions matched those of natural alkali bee aggregations. The result was a landscape engineered for a single purpose: to invite millions of wild bees to dig, nest, and multiply. Every detail, from the depth of the pipes to the texture of the soil, was tuned to the biology of a creature most people never noticed. For the families who built these beds, the risk was enormous. Thousands of dollars per acre spent on land that might never host a single bee. But in that calculated gamble, a new kind of agriculture was taking root. Devoting farmland to bare, salty ground ran against everything most growers believed. Yet in the Walla Walla Valley, families like the Inghams did not just risk a corner. Some set aside dozens of acres, land that could have grown wheat or hay, and dedicated it entirely to bee habitat. The beds looked like nothing but lifeless earth, a patchwork of gray and white, where crops would never take root. For years, neighbors shook their heads. Giving up that much productive ground for an insect sounded reckless, even desperate. But for those who made the leap, the decision was not just about science or profit. It was about faith in the land, in the bees, and in each other. The commitment extended beyond the farm gate. Local officials recognized what was at stake. On rural roads bordering the bee beds, county crews installed signs urging drivers to slow down. The speed limit dropped to 20 miles per hour, not for children or livestock, but for the bees themselves. The logic was simple: dust clouds and vibrations from fast-moving vehicles could disrupt the delicate nesting surface, scattering bees or collapsing their tunnels. For the first time, traffic laws treated insects as neighbors, not nuisances. Even delivery trucks and farm equipment adjusted their routes and routines out of respect for the pollinators working just below the surface. In coffee shops and church halls, the conversation shifted. What started as a gamble by a handful of families became a point of pride for the whole valley. School children learned about alkali bees, alongside lessons on wheat and irrigation. Local newspapers ran stories about the bee zone, and visitors came from other regions to see the experiment firsthand. The sacrifice of prime acreage, sometimes 30 acres or more, was not just a private risk. It became a community investment, one that bound neighbors together in a shared wager on something most people had never even noticed before. In this way, the valley's social fabric stretched to make room for millions of new residents, each one no bigger than a grain of rice, but together, powerful enough to change the fate of an entire crop. A single acre of bee bed, crusted with salt and seemingly lifeless from above, supports a population density that rivals any city. At the height of summer, researchers estimate that 40 million alkali bees are at work across the valley. Each female, driven by instinct and opportunity, emerges from her tunnel and launches herself into the purple haze of alfalfa bloom. The sound builds, not a buzz, but a low, steady hum that rolls over the fields and hangs in the air, a signature of life hidden just below the surface. Within this underground metropolis, each bee is an architect. Tunnels branch and curve, connecting thousands of nests in a living network. The density is staggering. Side by side, the bees dig their chambers, sometimes only inches apart. Above ground, their numbers are revealed in flashes, clouds of metallic bodies rising and settling, a constant relay between nest and flower. During the 6-week flowering window, a single acre of well-populated bee bed can service more than 100 acres of alfalfa. The pollination efficiency is unmatched. As each bee willingly trips the stubborn keel of the alfalfa flower, she does the work no honeybee would, unlocking pollen, fertilizing seeds, and ensuring the crop's future. On this scale, the results are transformative. That 1 acre of bee bed can help produce 100,000 pounds of clean alfalfa seed. The valley's fields, once silent and unproductive, now pulse with a hidden engine, a biological system that turns salt, soil, and sunlight into the raw material for farms across the continent. The payoff from the bee beds stunned even the most hopeful growers. In just a few seasons, Walla Walla Valley transformed into a powerhouse for alfalfa seed, supplying about a quarter of all the seed used across the United States. Regional revenue soared, with annual figures reaching $42 million, a number that would have sounded impossible to the first farmers who risked their land on bare, salty ground. For individual operations, the difference was even more striking. Some families reported that their bee beds added up to $1 million of value to the farm each year, built on reliable harvests and contracts that no longer fell through. Seed yields jumped by hundreds of pounds per acre, sometimes over 400 pounds more than fields pollinated by honeybees alone. What had started as a desperate experiment became the backbone of the valley's economy. Growers who once faced ruin now counted on the bees as business partners, not just a curiosity. One farmer described the bee beds as the best insurance money could buy. Others called them the valley's secret engine. The numbers told a story of risk turned into reward, and of a community that had learned to trust in something as small and unpredictable as a native bee. Disaster can strike in a single storm. Heavy spring rains once flooded entire bee beds, drowning thousands of developing larvae in their underground nests. The tunnels, so carefully built, collapsed under the sudden weight of water. Years of work vanished almost overnight. Farmers learned the hard way that the system was fragile, too much moisture, and the bees would not return. Extension scientists from Washington State University stepped in, helping growers redesign their beds with improved drainage and moisture control. Today, buried PVC pipes and gravel reservoirs let farmers fine-tune the water table, keeping the nesting band just damp enough for the bees, but never saturated. Remote sensors tucked beneath the salty crust send real-time readings of soil moisture and temperature, alerting managers to any sign of trouble before disaster can spread. Chemical threats have proven just as dangerous. In the past, a single mistimed pesticide spray could wipe out an entire season's bee population. Growers now follow strict integrated pest management plans, spraying only at night when the bees are safely underground. Pesticide choices are limited to the least toxic options, and applications happen only when pest monitoring shows no alternative. University researchers test every new chemical for its effects on alkali bees before it is approved for use. The community has built a culture of vigilance. One careless act can undo years of careful stewardship. Protecting the bee beds demands constant attention. From the first signs of rain to the last day of bloom, the lesson is clear. The miracle of millions of bees working beneath the desert's surface is never guaranteed. It survives only through relentless care and cooperation. Today, a quarter of America's alfalfa seed grows because native bees thrive where others fail. thanks to human stewardship, not control. As pollinator populations plummet worldwide, this partnership proves that working with nature can feed millions. Every summer, millions of alkali bees remind us, sometimes the future depends on protecting what's already beneath our feet. Nearly half of our planet is turning to desert, swallowing farms, villages, and futures. Nowhere is this happening faster than Kubuki, a land once dense with rivers and grass, now crushed by dunes taller than skyscrapers. The world's best scientists and massive government programs failed for decades. So when a poor teacher unleashed 4.5 million rabbits, aiming to turn dead sand green, it sounded like madness. How did a forbidden experiment in China become a global model worth $10 billion, while the rest of the world still struggles? This is where the story, and the stakes, truly begin. Across continents, deserts are not just growing, they are swallowing the land beneath our feet. According to the United Nations, up to 41% of Earth's surface is now classified as dry land, degraded, or at serious risk of desertification. That means nearly half the world's land is losing the battle against drought, wind, and sand. More than 40% of what remains is under threat. With billions of people living in regions where crops fail, water dries up, and dust storms force families to flee their homes, the scale is almost unimaginable. Every year, millions of acres of once productive soil turn to dust, pushing migration, hunger, and poverty in their wake. This is not just a problem for one country or one continent. From the Sahel in Africa to the grasslands of Central Asia, from southern Europe to the American Southwest, the same story repeats. Land that once fed villages now lies barren, stripped of life by relentless sun and wind. The crisis touches every corner of the globe, and the numbers keep rising. But while most efforts have struggled to slow the tide, there is one place where the desert's advance was not only halted, but reversed. In northern China, a region once written off as lost has become a living challenge to the idea that deserts are forever. The story of Kubuki stands as proof that even on a planet facing a dry land emergency, hope can take root in the unlikeliest of places. The Kubuki Desert stretches across more than 7,000 square miles in Inner Mongolia, a vast expanse of shifting sand nearly the size of Massachusetts. For generations, families carved out a living here, tending crops and raising livestock on grasslands that once rolled toward the horizon. But year after year, the land changed. The fierce winds scoured the surface, stripping away soil and carrying it east. The dunes, once distant, began to move. Some rose as high as multi-story buildings, their crests reshaped by every storm. Villages disappeared beneath the sand, roads vanished, and rivers dried to memory. Over decades, thousands of acres of farmland were buried, and the desert's edge crept ever closer to the last remaining settlements. Entire communities packed up what little they could save and left, forced out by the relentless advance of sand. The air filled with dust so thick that daylight seemed to vanish. In the heart of Kubuki, life itself was fading. The land that once fed families now offered nothing but silence and emptiness. With every lost field and abandoned home, the crisis deepened, leaving behind a landscape that appeared beyond hope, a place where survival seemed impossible, and the desert itself became the enemy. In the decades after the land began to fail, China threw everything it could at the spreading sands. In the 1950s and the 1960s, the government launched sweeping campaigns to reclaim the desert's edge. Teams of workers planted long lines of windbreak forests across the north, hoping rows of poplars and willows could slow the relentless wind. Grazing bans spread across the region, forcing herders to keep their flocks away from fragile grasslands. Deep wells were drilled in search of water, and sand barriers were built to hold the dunes in place. The ambition was enormous, but the desert proved stubborn. Imported tree species withered in dry, salty ground. Without local roots, many saplings died within seasons. Windbreaks broke down, and the sand rolled over them, Grazing bans, though well-intentioned, left many families struggling to survive, and some ignored the rules just to get by. Wells often ran dry, and the cost of pumping water soared far beyond what villagers could afford. For every patch of green that took hold, acres more slipped away. The sand kept advancing, swallowing the hard work of thousands. Yet the effort never stopped. Year after year, new plans were drawn, new forests planted, new wells dug. Each failure was met with another attempt, driven by the conviction that the land could not be abandoned. But by the late 20th century, it was clear that something different was needed. The old methods could slow the desert, but they could not turn it back. The door was open for a new kind of thinking, one that would look beyond brute force and search for a way to work with the land itself. In 1988, the Kubuki Desert pressed in on all sides, threatening to erase the last traces of human effort. Roads vanished beneath dunes. Salt trucks sat stranded, engines choked by sand. The salt works, once the economic heart of the area, teetered on the brink. For Wang Wenbiao, newly appointed head of the factory and a former teacher who had grown up in the region, the crisis was personal. Hundreds of families depended on the salt works for survival. As creditors circled and profits disappeared, Wang faced a choice: abandon the business or confront the desert head-on. He chose the latter, staking his future on a simple but radical idea. For every ton of salt sold, he set aside 5 yuan as a self-imposed planting levy. There were no outside investors, no government bailouts. The fund grew slowly, one shipment at a time. Wang rallied his staff, asking them to plant trees during the off-season. They worked with shovels, buckets, and bare hands, planting saplings along the factory's edge. The aim was immediate: build a living barrier to hold back the advancing sands, protect the salt lake, and keep the business afloat long enough to plan for something bigger. Skepticism ran deep. Many saw the effort as futile, convinced the desert would swallow the trees as it had everything else. But as the first windbreaks took root, the sand near the factory began to settle. Salt production stabilized. A thin ring of green appeared where there had only been dust. For the first time in years, the salt works posted a modest profit. Instead of retreating, Wang reinvested every yuan. He expanded the planting fund, brought in more local families, and experimented with different tree species. He studied the desert's patterns, learning from each setback. Wang's ambitions grew with each season. He set a target that seemed almost impossible: to reclaim 1,400 square miles of desert. He borrowed against the future, risking his own home as collateral when banks hesitated. He promised workers a share of any future profits, turning the salt works into a community effort. Every sapling became a small act of resistance. Every patch of green, a sign that the desert could be pushed back. The internal planting levy became the backbone of this fight. It funded experiments, paid workers, and built trust among local families. It also marked a shift. The desert would be challenged, not with desperation, but with business sense and shared sacrifice. In the heart of the Kubuki, hope began to take root, anchored by a teacher's vow and a community's refusal to surrender. What started as a last stand for a struggling factory set the stage for a new phase in the battle against the desert. On the edge of the Kubuki Desert, a new kind of partnership took root, one that relied not on machines or chemicals, but on the quiet work of willows and rabbits. Wang Wenbiao and the local farmers looked beyond brute force, searching for a way to turn barren sand into living soil. They found their answer in a closed loop that mimicked nature's own cycles, linking trees, animals, and earth in a single, self-sustaining system. The first step was the willow. Hardy and drought-resistant, willows could survive where almost nothing else could. Their roots reached deep into the sand, anchoring dunes and drawing up what little moisture lay hidden below. Over the years, Wang's teams planted millions, by some local accounts more than 300 million willows, across the shifting landscape. Each tree was a living barrier, slowing the wind, trapping dust, and shading the ground. But willows alone were not enough. The sand still lacked the one thing real soil needs: organic matter. That's where the rabbits came in. Wang introduced Rex rabbits, a breed known for their resilience and rapid reproduction. Unlike livestock that require abundant water and pasture, Rex rabbits thrive on dry grass and willow shoots. They can withstand desert winters and multiply quickly, offering families a new source of income. But their real gift lay in their droppings. Rabbit manure is rich in nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, the very nutrients missing from desert sand. Each pellet is a tiny package of fertilizer. And because rabbits cannot digest many seeds, their manure naturally spreads new life across the dunes. Farmers soon noticed the change. Where rabbits grazed and willows grew, the sand began to darken. Manure mixed with fallen leaves, building up rich, brown humus. Project reports claim that each acre in this system can yield over 5 tons of organic matter every year. Within just a few years, what had been sterile sand could hold water, support crops, and resist the wind. The willow-rabbit loop turned a vicious cycle of loss into a virtuous one. Trees fed rabbits, rabbits fed the soil, and the soil fed new trees. Nothing was wasted. Every element served more than one purpose, and every family involved had a direct stake in the land's recovery. This was not a miracle of luck or a gamble with nature. It was careful engineering, rooted in observation and patience. By working with the land's limits instead of fighting them, Wang and his neighbors created a system that brought prosperity as well as hope. The desert, once an enemy, became a partner. In the process, a new kind of wealth began to grow, not just in harvests and pelts, but in the promise that even the harshest places can be made to bloom. Vast stretches of sand once defined the heart of Kabuki, but today satellite images reveal a different story. What was once a barren expanse now glows with swaths of green, covering 1,200 square miles that had been lifeless for decades. On the ground, the change is impossible to ignore. In areas where sandstorms once raged unchecked, the air is calmer, wind speeds have dropped, and the dunes no longer march across the land. Measurements show that more than 15 million tons of sand are now held in place each year by the roots of willows and the humus built by rabbit manure. The soil, once dry and powdery, is rich and dark, able to hold water and support new life. In places where wells had long run dry, groundwater levels have risen by as much as 6.5 feet over 20 years. Farmers who once watched their fields vanish beneath the dunes now draw water at half the depth they needed before. Wildlife, too, has returned. Deer, foxes, and birds find shelter among the willows, and native grasses push up through soil that was once only dust. The transformation is visible from space, but its real impact is felt in every inch of land that has been brought back from the edge. Here, the landscape itself stands as proof that even the harshest desert can be made to bloom. Sunlight once bounced off endless dunes, but in Kabuki, it now powers a new kind of wealth. Engineers mapped out nearly 200,000 solar panels, an array shaped like a galloping horse, visible even from space. This is the Junma Solar Farm, built on land that was once considered hopeless. The panels stretch across stabilized sand, capturing enough energy each year to supply hundreds of millions of kilowatt-hours to the grid. In practical terms, that is clean electricity for a city the size of Miami, all produced where nothing but wind and dust ruled before. But the impact runs deeper than energy. The panels cast shade, slowing evaporation and creating pockets of moisture where grasses and wildflowers can take hold. Underneath, sheep and rabbits graze, keeping the land healthy and doubling as natural lawnmowers. Local families tend both panels and pastures, earning steady wages where there was only poverty a decade ago. The Junma project became a symbol of a new green economy, one that links technology, ecology, and community. Over the past 10 years, the combined force of solar power, restored land, and sustainable industries has generated more than $10 billion in economic value. More than 10,000 families have moved out of poverty, building new lives on ground that once drove them away. In Kubuki, prosperity grows from both the sun and the sand, showing that economic hope and environmental healing can go hand in hand. In 2011, the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification recognized Kubuki as a global model for reversing land degradation, a rare honor given to only a handful of sites worldwide. The world's attention turned to Inner Mongolia, where willows, rabbits, and solar panels had restored life to one of the harshest deserts on Earth. Delegations arrived from Africa, the Middle East, and Southern Europe, searching for answers they could bring home to their own threatened lands. But as Kubuki's story spread, a note of caution traveled with it. History offered a stark warning from the other side of the planet. In the mid-1800s, just 24 European rabbits were released into the wilds of Australia. Within 50 years, that small number multiplied into more than 1 billion, stripping grasslands bare and turning vast stretches of fertile country into dust. That Australian disaster showed what happens when a single solution is unleashed without careful planning or control. In contrast, Kubuki relied on strict management. Rabbits were raised only within closed systems, every element serving a purpose, every risk weighed. The approach combined community stewardship, deliberate design, and continuous oversight. The lesson was clear. Restoration demands not just hope and effort, but responsibility. The world saw in Kubuki both a miracle and a reminder that working with nature requires humility as well as ambition. Today, nearly half our planet faces desertification, but Kubuki stands as living proof that even the harshest lands can be reborn. As global droughts worsen, the world looks to solutions born from courage and creativity, not just technology. The lesson is clear. Transformation starts where hope refuses to die. For 86 years, the Upper Columbia River was silent, its salmon runs wiped out by a dam so massive it severed an ancient lifeline. When Canada released 8,000 salmon fry into what had become a dead river, experts and entire nations doubted they would ever return. But 2 years later, something happened that no one dared predict. What did these fish reveal about the fate of a forgotten ecosystem? And why did their journey spark a reckoning that could transform the river's future? In 1939, the Grand Coulee Dam rose from the Columbia River Valley, a concrete wall stretching over 4,000 feet long and standing more than 500 feet high. Its construction demanded nearly a decade of labor and more than 12 million cubic yards of concrete, dwarfing anything built in North America before. When the last bucket of concrete was poured, the river's course was changed forever. The dam's reservoir, Lake Roosevelt, swallowed entire valleys and submerged ancient salmon's spawning grounds beneath deep, cold water. There were no fish ladders. No passage was built for the millions of salmon that once surged upstream each year. The river's upper reaches in British Columbia, where salmon had returned for thousands of years, were cut off in a single engineering decision. Even as the turbines began to spin, delivering electricity and irrigation water across the Pacific Northwest, the migration routes that had shaped the region's ecology and culture vanished overnight. The Grand Coulee Dam became an immovable barrier. For the salmon, it was the end of the line. For the indigenous nations who depended on those runs, it was the loss of a living connection to the land and water. The river above the dam fell silent, its ancient pulse broken not by drought or famine, but by the weight of concrete and the priorities of a new era. The silence that followed the damming of the Columbia was not just the absence of fish, it was the hollowing out of a way of life. For the Syilx, Okanagan, Secwepemc, and Ktunaxa nations, the river had always been a living thread, carrying salmon upstream each year, a gift that fed families, shaped ceremonies, and anchored identity. Without the salmon, diets shifted to whatever could be gathered or hunted, but nothing filled the missing space left by a vanished staple that once made up half of what people ate. In stories, elders spoke of the river's bounty, but for generations, children only knew the emptiness. the ecosystem suffered alongside the people. In the years after the dams, the Upper Columbia's headwaters grew poor in nutrients. Where salmon carcasses once fed forests and fueled the food web, the land became thin and quiet. Eagles and bears found less to eat. Even the trees lining the banks lost the richness that salmon brought from the sea. The river, once alive with movement and memory, became a corridor of loss. Yet the grief did not fade into resignation. Across decades, the nations refused to let the silence become permanent. They gathered at the banks to remember, to mourn, and to promise that the river would not be forgotten. The absence of salmon became a call, a shared resolve to restore what was lost, not just for themselves, but for the land and all its living relatives. In 2019, leaders from the Syilx Okanagan, Secwep MC, and Katunaxa nations gathered to launch a new kind of restoration effort. They called it Bringing the Salmon Home. For generations, their communities had watched the Upper Columbia remain empty, but their vision was not just about fish. It was about restoring a relationship, a duty to the river, to ancestors, and to future generations. The initiative was built on Indigenous knowledge councils, where elders, knowledge holders, and community members shaped every decision. Each nation brought its own protocols, languages, and ceremonies, weaving them together into a collective approach that crossed borders and bureaucracies. Judson Thomas, a working group member, described the intent. "This is for our grandchildren, for the river, and for all our relations." The plan was never to simply restock fish. It meant honoring creation stories, respecting the laws of the land, and addressing the wounds left by colonization. The Knowledge Council set out guidelines that would guide not just the return of salmon, but the health of the entire basin. Partnerships with the Canadian and British Columbia governments brought in scientific tools, genetic analysis, tagging, and monitoring, but the direction remained firmly in Indigenous hands. Decisions were made through storytelling, consensus, and ceremony, not just technical reports. The September 2023 Indigenous Knowledge Statement laid out the core principles. Salmon restoration could only succeed if led by those who had lived with the river the longest. Each step, from habitat preparation to the timing of the release, was rooted in both ancient teachings and new science. The blueprint was set. The next challenge would be to put it into action. On a cool spring morning in 2023, the banks of the Upper Columbia near Castlegar filled with voices, song, and the steady beat of drums. Community members gathered in a circle, elders and children side by side. This was more than a scientific trial. It was a complete homecoming, witnessed by those whose families had waited generations for this day. About 10,000 sockeye salmon fry, each no longer than a finger, glinted in the morning light. Before their journey began, each fish was tagged, a tiny 12mm marker beneath the skin, nearly invisible but vital for tracking their path. The tags would carry the memory of this place with them, a silent promise that some would one day return. The ceremony unfolded with prayers and gratitude, offered in the languages of the Syilx, Okanagan, Secwep MC, and Katunaxa. Some participants scattered cedar boughs on the water, others sang ancestral songs. The release was careful and deliberate. Children crouched at the water's edge, their hands steady as they let the fry slip into the current. Each release was an act of hope, a message sent downstream that the river was ready to welcome its salmon home again. As the last fry darted into the cold water, a hush settled over the crowd. The journey ahead would be perilous. Hundreds of kilometers, dozens of obstacles, and the vast uncertainty of the ocean. But for the first time in more than 80 years, the Upper Columbia was alive with possibility. In the heat of summer 2025, a monitoring station at Wells Dam in Washington picked up a signal that no one had expected so soon. The PIT tag reader, buried in the concrete fish ladder, flashed a code, then another. 2 adult sockeye, tagged as fry in the Upper Columbia 2 years earlier, had made the impossible journey home. Staff stared at the readout, double-checked the tag numbers against the 2023 release list. There was no mistake. These were the first salmon in more than 80 years to return from ocean to the upper Columbia against all odds. Word spread from the control room to biologists and community leaders. For a moment, the room hung in disbelief. The river's pulse, silent for generations, had sent a message back. The salmon remembered the way. Celebrations swept through the upper Columbia as news of the Sockeyes' return spread. In community halls and riverside gatherings, elders who once spoke only of loss now shared stories of hope. Children danced and sang beside the water, their faces painted with salmon scales, while leaders from the Syilx, Okanagan, Secwepemc, and Katunaxa nations offered thanks in their languages. Drummers kept a steady rhythm as people embraced, some in tears, others laughing in disbelief. For many, it felt like a promise finally kept, not just to ancestors, but to generations yet to come. Chief Keith Crow called it a moment of healing, saying the salmon belong here. And with ceremony, indigenous knowledge, Western science, and determination, we are bringing them home. Scientists and guardians stood side by side, their efforts validated in a way that data alone could never capture. The river, once silent, echoed with celebration. Today, 2 salmon made it home, but thousands more still face impossible barriers. As governments update the Columbia River Treaty, the world watches. Because restoring a river is not just about fish. It's about reviving a living system and deciding what futures we dare to imagine.
15 years ago, Australia's greatest river system stopped flowing. Farmland turned to dust, and nearly 90% of its freshwater turtles vanished, pushed to the edge by predators and an unthinkable drought. Scientists responded with a desperate experiment, raising and releasing 1 million baby turtles into waterless rivers that seemed beyond hope. Now, evidence reveals the true, startling aftermath and the stakes for an entire continent if the rivers fail again. Where did all those turtles go? Stretching across more than 1 million square kilometers, the Murray-Darling Basin is the beating heart of Australia's inland. Its rivers and wetlands feed nearly 1 in 3 Australians, winding through farms, towns, and ancient floodplains. For generations, families have relied on these waters to raise cattle, grow wheat, and support entire communities. The basin's 77,000 kilometers of rivers and creeks supply about 40% of the nation's food, linking distant cities with the fortunes of rural towns. Standing at the edge of a dry bybong, a farmer recalls the days when the river would rise and fall with the seasons, bringing life to the land and certainty to those who worked it. We used to count on the floods, he says, knew when to plant, when to harvest. The river was our calendar. But the basin is more than a source of crops or drinking water. For Indigenous people, these rivers are living ancestors woven into stories and ceremony for tens of thousands of years. Rangers describe the sound of turtles slipping into the water, pelicans circling overhead, and the quiet resilience of red gum forests, each a sign that the river is still breathing. When the waters recede, everything changes. Livestock wander through cracked mud where reeds once grew. Local shops close as families move away, chasing rain that never comes. In some towns, water trucks become more common than school buses. The sense of loss is personal, immediate. A river that once united communities now divides them, its absence felt in every empty paddock and silent main street. The fate of the basin is the fate of the nation. If these rivers fail, it's not just wildlife at risk, but the lives and livelihoods of millions. The scale is almost impossible to grasp. An entire continent holding its breath, waiting for the water to return. In the summer of 2007, the rivers of the Murray-Darling Basin began to disappear. Whole stretches that once shimmered with water turned to cracked, sun-bleached clay. By 2009, satellite images revealed scars where wetlands had been. Ancient red gum forests, whose roots once drank deeply from the floodplain, stood dead and gray, their branches stripped bare by years without flow. Where fish once darted beneath lies, the only movement came from clouds of flies circling rotting carcasses in shrinking pools. A ranger walks the riverbank, boots sinking into powdery dust where water used to lap. He remembers the first time he saw an entire lagoon vanish. He says quietly that it was like losing a friend. You would come back each week, and the water would be lower. The birds gone. The turtles stranded in the mud. Across the basin, towns faced a new kind of drought. Farmers lined up for water deliveries as dams ran dry. In Menendez, the Darling River's flow stopped for months, an event without precedent in living memory. Livestock wandered through empty channels, searching for patches of green. In some places, the only water left was too salty or foul to drink. Children learned to brush their teeth using bottled water. Shops closed their doors as families left, forced out by a river that could no longer support them. The ecological toll was staggering. Mass fish kills left the banks littered with silver scales and bones. Frogs fell silent on the sandbanks. Fox tracks crisscrossed between the scattered remains of turtle nests. Without flowing water, even the most resilient species struggled to survive. The river was no longer a source of life, but a reminder of everything that could be lost when the rains failed. For those who stayed, the silence was the hardest part. No splash of turtles, no chorus of birds at dawn, just the wind and the memory of water. Decades ago, the rivers of the Murray-Darling Basin teemed with turtle. Children would spot their dome shells in every creek in Bebong. Today, those same stretches are eerily quiet. Recent surveys paint a stark picture. Across much of southeastern Australia, up to 91% of freshwater turtles have vanished in just 40 years. In some reaches, the numbers are even more dire. Scientists searching for the broad-shelled turtle along the lower Murray found barely a trace. Fewer than 200 adults left in entire river systems where there were once millions. The culprits are relentless. European reed foxes, introduced more than a century ago, patrol the sandy banks each nesting season. They dig up nearly every clutch of eggs, destroying up to 95% before a single hatchling ever sees water. Even those that make it out face shrinking wetlands and evaporating pools, stranded by droughts that last longer each decade. Without flowing water, young turtles are left exposed in muddy traps. Easy prey for predators are doomed by the heat. Dr. Ricky Spencer, a biologist who has spent years tracking turtles through the basin, describes the situation as a silent extinction. It is not just one bad year or a single drought. Every year, foxes take almost all the nests. Every year, fewer babies survive. We are watching entire populations collapse in slow motion. This loss is not limited to a single species. The Murray River turtle, the eastern long-necked turtle, and the broad-shelled turtle all have suffered massive declines. Once their presence kept rivers clean, cycling nutrients and scavenging dead fish. Now, with so few left, the ecological balance has tipped. For the scientists on the ground, the question is no longer if turtles will disappear from some rivers, but when. The emergency is real, and the clock is running out. In 2019, a new idea began to circulate among scientists, rangers, and local communities along the Murray-Darling. The numbers were bleak. Turtle populations collapsing, rivers turning to dust, and old ways of life slipping out of reach. But instead of accepting the loss, a group of biologists and indigenous rangers asked a different question. What if the answer was scale? Not a 100 turtles or 1,000, but 1 million. Could a project that bold even work? Associate Professor Ricky Spencer, who had spent years tracking turtles through drying wetlands, was among the first to push for something bigger. He knew that protecting a handful of nests or releasing a few hatchlings would never outpace the losses. The plan that took shape was simple in theory and daunting in practice. Collect eggs from vulnerable riverbanks, raise the hatchlings in safety until they were big enough to survive, and then return them to the wild by the thousands. The goal was to tip the balance, give the river a fighting chance by flooding it with new life. This was not just a job for scientists. Indigenous rangers, whose families had watched over these rivers for generations, joined the effort. Their knowledge of nesting sites and seasonal changes shaped every step. Community volunteers, school children, and farmers signed up to help, turning the project into a national movement. Training sessions taught people how to spot nests, protect eggs from foxes, and log turtle sightings using a simple phone app. Neighborhoods that had once watched the river fade now found themselves on the front lines of a rescue mission. The logistics were staggering. Eggs had to be collected before foxes found them, then carefully transported to temperature-controlled facilities. Each hatchling spent 9 to 12 months growing in tanks and ponds, fed and monitored by teams of carers. For many, it was their first close look at a creature they had only heard about in stories. By the end of that first year, hundreds of nests had been saved, and thousands of young turtles were growing stronger every day. The ambition was clear: reach 1 million and maybe, just maybe, restore the river's future. Egg collection begins at dawn, when the riverbanks are cool and quiet. Teams of scientists and local volunteers scan the sand for the telltale tracks of nesting turtles. Each nest is carefully uncovered, the eggs counted and marked to keep their orientation, then lifted into padded crates. Timing is everything. Move the eggs too late, and foxes will have already found them. On average, the program rescues eggs from more than 900 nests each year, with each clutch holding a dozen to 20 fragile lives. Inside the laboratory, the eggs settle into rows of temperature-controlled incubators. Staff monitor humidity and temperature around the clock, knowing that even a slight change can affect whether the hatchlings will be male or female. For the next 2 to 3 months, the eggs are weighed and checked for signs of mold or dehydration. The goal is simple: give each embryo the best possible chance to hatch, free from predators in the extremes of the riverbank. When the first tiny turtles break through their shells, they are moved to clean, filtered tanks. Here, the work of growing them to a safe size begins. Hatchlings feed on a diet of insects, small fish, and aquatic plants, mimicking the variety they would find in the wild. Water quality is tested daily. Technicians track growth rates, adjusting food and temperature to encourage steady development without deformities. Disease is a constant threat. Any sign of illness triggers immediate quarantine and veterinary care. After 9 to 12 months, the young turtles weigh between 400 and 600 green, too large for most foxes to swallow. Some are tagged for future monitoring. Others are grouped by species and age, ready for release. The process is labor-intensive, often running on the energy of students, rangers, and retirees working side by side. Each turtle that leaves the facility represents months of vigilance and care, and a new chance for the rivers to recover. Buckets of young turtles, each one nearly the size of a human hand, lined the banks of the Murray on a cool morning in 2021. Rangers and community volunteers moved quickly, working in teams to carry the hatchlings from holding tanks to the water's edge. Some children, faces lit with nervous excitement, knelt beside the buckets and watched as the first turtles slipped into the shallows. In that single week, nearly 10,000 juveniles raised for months in protected tanks, fed and checked daily, entered the wild across dozens of restored wetlands. The scale was unlike anything seen before in these rivers. The release was timed with the return of environmental water. Pumps had been running for days, refilling bybongs and backwaters that had stood empty for years. As the turtles hit the water, they vanished almost instantly beneath the surface, scattering into reeds and submerged logs. For rangers, it was a rare moment of hope after years of loss. One field ecologist, standing ankle-deep in the muddy bank, explained that these head-started turtles were now large, enough to escape the jaws of foxes, the main threat that had wiped out so many nests in the past. Early signs of change arrived faster than anyone expected. In one restored reach, researchers had been monitoring the fate of dead carp left behind after a fish kill. In previous years, the carcasses would rot for weeks, turning the water foul and choking out oxygen. But with turtles back in numbers, the story was different. Within 2 days, most of the carp had been stripped clean, shells and heads poking out from the mud, the rest gone. Water tests showed a jump in oxygen levels, and the stench that once hung over the riverbank faded. It wasn't just the turtles. Native fish schools began to reappear, and birds returned to hunt along the edges. For the people who had spent years watching the rivers decline, these early results felt like a turning point. The project was no longer just an idea or a hope. It was alive, moving through the water with every turtle that disappeared into the reeds, each one carrying the promise of a cleaner, living river. High above the Murray Darling, satellite images from 2019 showed a landscape scarred by drought. Long brown stretches where rivers once curled through the floodplain. Just a few years later, those same images reveal a dramatic transformation. Ribbons of green threading across the basin, wetlands bursting back to life. A remote sensing analyst scanning the data points to the numbers behind the change. In one reach, plant cover jumped from barely 3% during the worst of the drought to over 60% as water and life returned. These are not isolated patches. Across the basin, the data tell the same story. Vegetation surging back in places where the rivers had been written off as lost. On the ground, the difference is unmistakable. Where dust and dead trees once dominated, thick mats of submerged plants now anchor the riverbed. This recovery is not just about water. With foxes unable to prey on the larger head-started turtles, survival rates for released juveniles have soared. Early tracking shows that most of these young turtles now survive their most vulnerable years, an astonishing recovery from the near-total losses of the past. The rivers are not just greener. They are alive in a way that has not been seen for decades. For the scientists and communities who watch the basin fade to brown, the data offer more than hope. They are proof that whole ecosystems can rebound given the right chance. A quiet sense of triumph runs through the basin as the project's milestone comes into focus. More than 1 million turtles protected, raised, and released now swim in rivers that only a decade ago seemed beyond saving. For the project coordinator, the number is less a promise than a finish line. Every nest saved, every hatchling grown, is a step toward a future where the rivers can sustain themselves. On the banks of the Murray, a Yorta Yorta elder stands beside the water, holding a young turtle in his hands. He recalls the old stories, the ceremonies that once welcomed turtles back each year. For the first time in half a century, those ceremonies are being revived. Children gather by the water's edge, learning the songs and responsibilities their grandparents feared would be lost. The river's recovery is not just ecological, it is cultural, a reconnection to country and tradition. Yet, the work is unfinished. Foxes still prowl the nesting banks, and European carp continue to dominate the water. Climate change brings longer, harsher droughts. The program faces a funding gap that could halt progress just as momentum builds. Internationally, scientists from Florida to India are watching, eager to adapt lessons from Australia's Head Start model. The basin story now serves as a test for river restoration worldwide, a reminder that hope alone is not enough. Without continued commitment, the hard-won gains could slip away, leaving the rivers and their people once again at risk. Australia's freshwater turtles now shape a living blueprint for global river recovery, a reminder that environmental collapse isn't fate, but a choice. As climate extremes intensify, the future of entire ecosystems hangs on decisions made today. The real test is whether this momentum outlasts the headlines. Restoration is possible, but only if we choose it again and again.
Yellowstone's rivers were unraveling, forests thinning, and by 1995, just one beaver colony clung to life while elk numbers soared to nearly 19,000. 14 wolves would change everything. They restored balance in ways no one predicted. But how could a handful of predators trigger a recovery so profound? It stunned the world's scientists. The answer begins with a decision made decades earlier. In 1926, the last wolf in Yellowstone was killed under orders from federal predator control programs. For decades, government trappers and hunters swept the park with rifles and poison, determined to remove every last wolf. Ranchers and local communities cheered their disappearance, convinced that fewer predators meant more livestock and game. Wolves were labeled as vermin, a threat to progress and prosperity. The campaign was systematic, backed by official policy and public support. No one considered the consequences for the land itself. With wolves gone, the park's natural balance was broken. The absence of this top predator removed a force that had quietly shaped the ecosystem for thousands of years. Elk, once wary and kept in check, lost their only natural enemy. Their numbers began to climb, but the warning signs went unnoticed. In the eyes of policymakers, the mission was accomplished. Yellowstone was now a park without wolves. It was seen as a triumph of human management, or so it seemed. The true cost of this decision would not become clear for generations. As the landscape began a slow and silent unraveling, elk multiplied quickly, filling Yellowstone's valleys and hillsides. By the early 1990s, their population on the northern range reached nearly 19,000, more than 4 times historic estimates. With no predators to fear, elk browsed day and night, stripping young aspens, willows, and cottonwoods from riverbanks. Saplings never grew tall enough to anchor the soil. The lush forests that once lined the streams vanished, leaving bare, exposed banks vulnerable to every spring flood. The rivers responded. Without roots to hold them, banks slumped and collapsed. Channels widened and split into braids, cutting through what had once been stable ground. Streams ran shallow and fast, carrying away more earth with every storm. What had been a network of meandering, shaded creeks became a landscape of eroding banks and sun-baked gravel. Beavers, once common throughout Yellowstone, faced a crisis. Their survival depends on willows and aspens for both food and building material. As elk devoured the last shoots, beaver colonies disappeared. By 1995, only a single beaver colony remained in the entire park, a stark reminder of how far the ecosystem had unraveled. Wetlands dried up, ponds vanished. Waterfowl, otters, and amphibians lost their homes. Decades of unchecked grazing had set off a chain reaction, stripping life from the rivers and silencing the wetlands. The park's natural engineers were gone, and with them, the pulse of water and life that once defined Yellowstone's valleys. On a bitter January 1995 morning, a convoy of trucks rolled into Yellowstone's Lamar Valley, each carrying a heavy steel crate. Inside, 14 gray wolves from Alberta, Canada, waited in uneasy silence. Years of debate and legal battles led to this moment. Ranchers and hunters had fought the plan, fearing for their herds and hunting grounds. Politicians argued in Congress, and the nation watched as the fate of the park hung in the balance. But biologists and conservationists pressed on, convinced that Yellowstone needed its lost predator. Molly Beatty, the first woman to lead the United States Fish and Wildlife Service, walked to the first crate. She reached in and with quiet determination carried the alpha female, number 5, into the acclimation pen. For weeks, the wolves remained in these enclosures, learning the scents and sounds of their new home. This slow-release method gave them a chance to adapt, to shed their fear of confinement, and to begin life as wild wolves once again. 14. Wolves, chosen for their genetic diversity and calm around humans, now stood at the threshold of a park that had not heard their howls in 70 years. The risk was enormous, but the hope was even greater. Wolves are social animals, and within months the newcomers began sorting themselves into packs. 17 more wolves arrived from British Columbia in 1996, doubling the population and setting the stage for complex alliances and rivalries. Each pack carved out its own territory. Some roamed the open valleys, others claimed the dense forests. The Druid Peak Pack quickly became the most studied, and in many ways the most storied. At its center was Wolf 21M, a large black-coated male whose behavior stood out even among seasoned observers. Unlike the ruthless reputation that often follows wolves, 21M was known for his restraint. In territorial clashes, he spared defeated rivals, allowing them to retreat instead of finishing them off. Researchers watched as he mourned the loss of packmates, lingering near their remains and refusing to leave. His leadership style earned him the nickname the Gentleman Wolf. Under his guidance, the Druid Peak Pack thrived, raising pups and defending their range with discipline rather than aggression. These early years revealed that wolves are more than predators. Their lives are shaped by loyalty, grief, and the subtle rules of family. The bonds inside each pack would soon ripple outward, shaping not just wolf society, but the entire landscape around them. Wolves brought more than teeth to Yellowstone. They brought a new kind of order. Elk, once fearless, began to avoid open riverbanks and tangled willow thickets, wary of ambush. Scientists called it the ecology of fear. For the first time in decades, young willows and aspens had a chance to grow. In some valleys, the volume of riparian vegetation soared by more than 1,500% within just a few years. The change was visible not just in the plants, but in the shape of the land itself. Tree roots gripped the soil, halting the relentless collapse of riverbanks. Channels that had sprawled wide and shallow began to narrow and deepen. Meanders returned, and pools formed where only gravel had remained. The rivers, once battered and unstable, now flowed with a steadier, more natural rhythm. Into this recovering landscape came the beavers. With willows thickening along the water's edge, the park's natural engineers set to work. From a single surviving colony in 1995, beaver numbers exploded to 121 colonies by 2024. Their dams spread water across the floodplain, creating new ponds and wetlands. Each dam slowed the current, filtered sediment, and raised the water table. Fish, birds, and otters followed, drawn to the mosaic of habitats beavers built. What began as a change in elk behavior rippled outward, transforming vegetation, reshaping rivers, and giving life back to the valley's architects. Scientists who had watched the park unravel now witnessed its revival, one link at a time. Wolf reintroduction changed not only the land, but the fortunes of the people living at Yellowstone's edge. In towns like Gardner, Montana, wolf watching became a draw for visitors from around the globe. Annual tourism revenue tied to the presence of wolves now reaches as high as $82 million, supporting local businesses and jobs that did not exist before. The economic payoff silenced many early critics who once feared wolves would only bring trouble. Inside the park, careful monitoring continues. The Yellowstone Wolf Project, led for decades by biologist Doug Smith, tracks every pack, every birth, every loss. As of late 2024, the population holds steady between 100 and 120 wolves across 9 packs, a number that reflects both resilience and the limits of the ecosystem. Researchers now understand that wolves acted as a catalyst, not a cure-all. Recent studies, including a 2025 synthesis, reveal that drought cycles, bison grazing, and shifts in river hydrology also shape the park's recovery. The story is not as simple as wolves alone saving Yellowstone, but the evidence is clear. Their return set in motion changes no single human project could have engineered. The lessons from these hills now ripple outward, studied by scientists and land managers around the world. Today, Yellowstone's rivers run clearer, and beaver colonies multiply because a missing predator returned. As nations now look to restore lost species, Yellowstone proves nature's resilience is not theoretical. When we restore what we erased, entire landscapes can heal. Sometimes letting nature lead is the boldest act of all.
Every year, Africa loses forests the size of Switzerland, even as billions are spent planting new trees, and more than 80% of those seedlings die before they mature. But against all logic, farmers are restoring entire forests without planting a single tree, using a method that almost no one believed would work. If so much money and effort has failed, how are these forgotten roots transforming landscapes and lives? The answer challenges everything we think we know about reversing desertification. Across Africa, forests are vanishing at a rate unmatched anywhere else on Earth. Each year, 3.9 million hectares disappear, an area equal to Switzerland erased from the map. In Tanzania alone, nearly 500,000 hectares are lost annually, driven by the demand for farmland, charcoal, and timber. Satellite images reveal the steady advance of deserts, swallowing once productive fields and pushing deeper into rural communities. In the Sahel, dry winds sweep over land stripped of trees, leaving behind dust and brittle soil. The crisis is not confined to a single region. It stretches from Senegal's Atlantic coast to the plains of Ethiopia, affecting millions who depend on these landscapes for food and water. Nearly 41% of the world's land is now classified as dry land, or at risk of turning to desert, putting more than 2 billion people in jeopardy. As forests retreat, rainfall becomes less reliable, wells run dry, crops fail, families are forced to abandon their homes in search of better land. The pace of destruction has outstripped every conventional solution. In the face of such overwhelming loss, the search for quick fixes has become urgent, and the pressure to reverse the trend grows with every passing year. Governments and international donors poured billions of dollars into ambitious tree planting campaigns across Africa's drylands. The logic seemed sound. Plant enough trees and the desert would retreat. Yet the reality on the ground told a different story. In Niger, Tanzania, and across the Sahel, newly planted seedlings faced relentless heat, poor soil, and unpredictable rainfall. Most projects could not afford the years of watering, fencing, and protection needed for young trees to survive. Reports from the World Bank and major non-governmental organizations found that over 80% of seedlings died within the first few years, sometimes even more. Fields that had been covered with tiny green saplings at the start of the rainy season were bare again by the next. The cost of these efforts was staggering. Conventional planting schemes routinely spent hundreds of dollars per hectare, money that vanished as one failed project followed another. Even high-profile campaigns with celebrity endorsements and international backing struggled to keep seedlings alive. In many cases, tree planting became a cycle of hope and disappointment, with little to show for the investment except empty fields and frustrated communities. The promise of reversing desertification through mass planting faded as failure rates climbed and budgets ballooned. For many on the ground, it became clear that planting trees in these harsh climates was not just difficult, it was in most cases unsustainable. Tony Ronaldo spent years in Niger, watching seedling after seedling wither under the desert sun. Each failed planting drove home the same bleak reality. Nothing seemed to survive. One afternoon in the early 1980s, as he drove across a scorched plateau near Kananfa, a patch of green caught his eye. What looked like a scrappy bush stood alone in a field of dust. Tony stopped, curious. He knelt beside it, tracing the shoots down to the soil. There, hidden beneath the surface, was a thick stump, evidence of a tree that had once stood tall, its roots still alive and pushing up new growth. That moment was a discovery. The discovery rewrote everything he thought he knew about the land. The problem was not the absence of trees, but the way their regrowth had been overlooked and repeatedly cut down. Decades earlier, colonial authorities had cleared vast tracts of woodland for plantations and fuel, leaving behind stumps and root systems buried out of sight. Farmers, needing space for crops, had kept slicing away at anything that sprouted. Yet, underground, the forest had never truly died. As Tony looked out over the fields, he realized he was surrounded by a hidden network of living roots, each one capable of sending up new shoots if only given the chance. The solution was not to plant more trees, but to recognize and protect the ones already fighting to return. In that instant, The landscape shifted from hopeless to full of possibility, a quiet forest waiting for permission to grow. That shift felt like possibility. Farmer-managed natural regeneration, known as FMNR, relies on a simple biological truth hidden just beneath the surface. When a tree is cut down, its roots often remain alive underground. These roots, sometimes decades old, are packed with stored energy and ready to send up new shoots. But there is a catch. In a living tree, the main stem produces a hormone called auxin. Auxin travels down from the tip and keeps other buds in check, focusing the tree's energy into a single trunk. When the tree is cut, auxin production drops, and dozens of buds along the stump and roots burst into action, sending up a tangle of shoots. This is why so many fields across Africa are dotted with scruffy bushes, each one a tree trying to make a comeback, only to be cut again and again. FMNR turns this process on its head by working with nature, not against it. Farmers walk their fields and pick out the stumps with living shoots. From each stump, they choose one or two of the strongest, straightest shoots and prune away the rest. The selected shoots get all the energy from the established root system, so they grow fast and tall. Regular pruning, once or twice a year, keeps unwanted growth in check and shapes the new tree. There is no need for nurseries, plastic bags, or watering cans. The forest is already underground, waiting to be managed. The results are striking. In the first year, managed stumps send up strong vertical growth. By year 3, young trees provide real shade and start to stabilize the soil. By year 5, a full canopy can close over fields that were once bare. In these harsh climates, planted seedlings might take 15 to 20 years to reach the same size if they survive at all. FMNR lets farmers grow a working forest in under a decade, with nothing more than a sharp blade and a little know-how. In Niger, what began as a handful of farmers pruning old stumps has grown into a national phenomenon. Over 5 million hectares, an area larger than Costa Rica, now support a thriving canopy of regenerated trees. Satellite images from the U.S. Geological Survey reveal a dramatic transformation. Fields once stripped bare now shimmer with green. Where there were only scattered bushes, more than 200 million trees have returned. Each one counted not as a seedling planted, but as a survivor, brought back from the roots. Farmers across the Maradi and Zinder regions report their millet and sorghum harvests doubling, sometimes tripling, as shade and leaf litter restore fertility to the soil. The evidence is visible from space and tangible in every harvest. What was once a story of decline has become a model for hope, led not by outsiders, but by the hands of local champions. In Tanzania's Dodoma region, a quiet revolution is underway. Samuel Msanjila and the Lead Foundation have guided farmers to revive more than 500,000 hectares using kisiki hai, which in Swahili means living stump. This approach skips seedlings entirely. Instead, farmers select and nurture shoots from hidden root systems beneath their fields. The results ripple far beyond Tanzania. Across Africa, more than 18 million hectares have been restored by managing natural regrowth, not by planting new trees. The cost is almost negligible, often less than $20 per hectare. There is no need for expensive nurseries or years of irrigation. With only basic knowledge and a sharp blade, farmers transform barren land into working forests. The ecological payoffs are immediate. Restored shade, richer soil, and steadier rainfall follow quickly. As word spreads, champion farmers train neighbors, and the movement gathers speed. What began as a local experiment now offers a scalable, affordable answer for landscapes across the continent. Right now, more than 18 million hectares are regreening, not through outside intervention, but by trusting nature's own resilience. As climate threats accelerate, this approach proves that restoration does not always require new beginnings. Sometimes it means recognizing what survives beneath the surface.
A floating wasteland between California and Hawaii holds 1.8 trillion pieces of plastic, enough to outnumber the stars in the Milky Way. But one Dutch teenager saw it differently. He asked a question that changed everything. Why can't we clean this up? For decades, experts called it unfixable. The answer would ignite the largest ocean cleanup attempt in history, and what's happening now defies all expectations. In the heart of the Pacific, a swirling gyre of currents has gathered the world's plastic cast-offs into a zone of staggering proportions. Scientists began mapping this phenomenon in detail only recently, but the numbers are now impossible to ignore. The Great Pacific Garbage Patch stretches across 1.6 million square kilometers, about twice the size of Texas. Within this expanse, researchers estimate there are 1.8 trillion pieces of floating plastic. The total mass hovers around 100,000 tons, a figure that represents decades of discarded bottles, packaging, and fishing gear trapped by the ocean's slow-motion conveyor belts. Nearly half of this mass comes from ghost nets and abandoned fishing equipment, industrial debris that drifts for years, entangling marine life long after its original use. The rest is a mix of hard plastics, fragments, and microplastics, with large objects dominating the overall weight. Much of this plastic floats at the surface, exactly where countless fish, turtles, and seabirds come to feed. In these waters, what should be a thriving feeding ground has become a hazardous minefield of synthetic debris. Oceanographers have documented hundreds of kilograms of plastic per square kilometer in the patch's densest regions, while the food biomass is a fraction of that. Because plastic does not biodegrade on any human timescale, the patch is a living record of decades of global consumption, layer upon layer, still circulating within the gyre. For years, the sheer scale and remoteness of the patch left experts convinced that any attempt at cleanup would be futile, a logistical nightmare beyond the reach of modern technology. The question was not just how to clean it up, but whether it could ever be done at all. Boyan Slat was 16 when he slipped beneath the waves off the coast of Greece, expecting to find a world of vibrant fish and swaying seagrass. Instead, he surfaced in disbelief. Plastic bags drifted past his mask, ribbons of waste tangled in the current. He later recalled seeing more plastic than fish, an image that stuck with him long after he climbed back onto shore. That single dive sparked a stubborn question that would not let go. Why can't we just clean this up? Teachers, scientists, and even family told him it was impossible. The ocean was too vast, the plastic too scattered, the logistics beyond anything a teenager could tackle. But Boyan never dropped the question. He turned his frustration into a high school research project, digging into ocean currents and the science of plastic accumulation. Instead of letting expert doubt close the door, he started sketching designs in the margins of his notebooks, simple ideas for barriers that might catch drifting debris. Boyan's curiosity wasn't just academic. He built water-powered rockets in his backyard, and he tried to break world records for fun. The challenge of ocean plastic became personal, a puzzle he couldn't walk away from. He described himself as a problem solver at heart, and the more he learned, the more he believed a solution was possible if someone was stubborn enough to try. His question, dismissed as naive, became the seed of an idea that would soon draw the world's attention. In October 2012, Boyan Slat walked onto the stage at TEDx Delft, his voice steady, his idea simple: use floating barriers to let the ocean's own currents gather plastic for collection. The talk didn't just capture the room, it caught fire online. Within weeks, the video spread across continents, shared by environmentalists, engineers, and skeptics alike. People who had never met Boyan saw a teenager refusing to accept the word impossible and decided to help him prove the world wrong. The momentum became real when 38,000 people from 160 countries contributed to a global crowdfunding campaign. Their combined support raised $2.2 million, enough to fund a feasibility study and the first steps toward building a working prototype. The outpouring of donations wasn't just about the money. It was a collective leap of faith, a signal that the world was hungry for action and willing to bet on an untested idea from a young outsider. With the campaign's success, Boyan made a decision that would change his life. He left his aerospace engineering program at Delft University, channeling every hour and every cent into founding the Ocean Cleanup as a non-profit. The organization's first office was little more than borrowed space and a handful of volunteers, but the energy was unmistakable. Boyan's conviction drew in young engineers, scientists, and supporters who wanted to turn sketches and models into machines that could sweep the Pacific. What began as a single question from a teenage diver was now a movement, fueled by thousands who believed that cleaning the ocean was not only necessary, but possible. In September 2018, the Ocean Cleanup's first full-scale device, System 001, nicknamed Wilson, set out for the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. Towed hundreds of miles offshore, the long floating barrier was designed to corral drifting plastic, using only the ocean's currents and wind. For months, the world watched as updates trickled in from the open sea, but the promise of a breakthrough quickly collided with the reality of the Pacific. Crew members reported that plastic was slipping past the system's skirt, escaping faster than Wilson could retain it. In late December, a 59-foot section of the boom broke away under stress, forcing the team to halt operations and tow the damaged system back to port. News of the failure spread quickly. Headlines questioned whether the entire idea was doomed. Marine scientists who had doubted the concept from the start were blunt. The ocean was too powerful, the engineering too fragile, and the plastic too unpredictable. Boyan Slat, still in his early 20s, faced a wave of public skepticism and expert criticism. The setback was undeniable, a year's effort and millions of dollars undone by the relentless forces of the open sea. But inside the Ocean Cleanup, the failure became a turning point, pushing the team to rethink their approach and confront the complexity of cleaning the world's largest garbage patch. System 03 stretches more than 2 kilometers across the open Pacific, its wings forming a massive U that glides slowly through the heart of the garbage patch. This isn't just a bigger version of earlier attempts. Engineers reworked every detail after the first failures at sea, trading passivity for precision. 2 vessels now tow the system at walking speed, carefully steering through zones where models predict the densest plastic. The geometry creates a convergence point, funneling debris into a retention zone at the base of the U. Below the surface, a 4-meter-deep skirt acts as a selective barrier, so plastic gets trapped while fish and turtles can slip safely underneath. Inside the retention zone, underwater cameras and a remote-controlled safety hatch stand ready. If a marine animal enters, operators can trigger an escape route, releasing the animal without losing the entire catch. Every haul is monitored, sorted, and logged, with plastic compressed for shipment ashore. At peak efficiency, System 03 can sweep an area the size of a football field every 5 seconds. The team's focus on ecological safeguards and operational control has turned what was once a fragile prototype into a robust, repeatable process. For the first time, the dream of large-scale ocean cleanup is no longer just theoretical. It's working, and every catch is proof. By the end of 2025, the Ocean Cleanup had pulled more than 45 million kilograms of plastic from oceans, rivers, and coastlines worldwide. The teenager's question that started it all now operates on a scale few imagined possible. 20 interceptor systems are at work in 9 countries, capturing plastic in rivers before it ever reaches the sea. In some of the world's most polluted urban waterways, the organization's new 30 Cities program aims to cut up to 1/3 of riverborne plastic, targeting the sources that feed the ocean's plastic burden. The proof isn't just in the numbers. Plastic retrieved from the Pacific has found new life as sunglasses, car trunk liners for Kia, and even notebook covers for Coldplay fans, demonstrating that ocean plastic can become a resource, not just a symbol of waste. Partnerships with global brands help fund further cleanup and show that the cycle can be closed. Scientific research continues to guide every step. Studies have confirmed that plastic pollution threatens marine life at every level, and the project's own monitoring shows that careful design can minimize harm to sea creatures. The Ocean Cleanup's approach now stands as a comprehensive response, removing legacy pollution, intercepting new waste upstream, and supporting policy change with data. Boyan Slat, once dismissed as an idealist, was named a United Nations Champion of the Earth in his early 20s. Today he leads a team of over 150 professionals in Rotterdam, all working toward a single goal: to remove 90% of floating ocean plastic by 2040. The once impossible dream now has a blueprint and a global movement behind it. Every minute, truckloads of plastic still pour into our oceans. Yet for the first time, we're not just imagining solutions, we're seeing them scale.